Just a minute. It has my wrong camera. So here we go. I have my webcam, which is better than... Actually, that's not too bad. Maybe I'll just stick with this. Yeah, let's go with that. I have a very precarious setup here. I apologize. Okay. Wow, what a day. Do I sound... I probably sound like... Did that just move? I probably sound like I'm in a tin can. Can you hear me okay? I am in a new hotel room, and so things are a little bit different, but we're gonna make it work. There's like a desk in here that is very cute and has no light. Like it looks like like there's light behind me, but it's like I'm just like... It looks like when like a TV show wants to have an anonymous source, and so they like backlight them, so they just show up like silhouette. That's what it looks like. So I am basically live streaming out of my sink right now. But we're gonna make it work. Okay. Also, I'm hoping Rodeo will sponsor me. We'll see. I'm kidding, but I have used like a whole full half of a notebook today. Stream might be frozen. I hope that's just for one person because there's nothing I can do about it if the internet here is bad. Let me just get to my notes from today, and then I will get you up to speed on what the hell happened. I do need to get a new notebook because I got to the point where I was having to write on the back of pages today. I am about as concise when it comes to note-taking as I am when it comes to speaking. You want a picture of the sketchy setup? Yeah, I know. It literally is like, it's very funny. Okay, so let's talk about what happened today and why I am not on a plane home right now, or I guess waiting in the airport to get on a plane home. So for those of you who followed what happened yesterday, there was the prosecution finished up with one final witness, and then there were two defense witnesses that they brought to do basically testimony on some various stuff. And then there was going to be the beginning of the defense case, or the beginning, well, it was the beginning of the defense case, but there was the beginning of the Sam Bankman-Fried testimony. And so that always starts out with basically whoever's testifying gets asked questions by the team that brought them. So in this case, it was the defense team, after which point there is the opportunity for cross-examination. And then at the end of that, there's an opportunity for rebuttal. That's just how all the witnesses go. There was a dispute yesterday over... People want updates on my dog. I will give that in a second. There was a dispute yesterday over the admissibility of some of the stuff that the defense basically wanted to ask Sam about. And I mentioned this yesterday, but just to catch people up very briefly, there basically has been this ongoing conflict between the prosecution and the defense over what Sam Bankman-Fried is allowed to say around advice of counsel, because they're not bringing a formal advice of counsel defense, and therefore they need to be very cautious to like not seem like that's what they're doing. And so anytime Sam Bankman-Fried like refers to consulting a lawyer or talking to a lawyer or anything like that, they get very like edgy about it because they don't want him to sort of cross the line there. And so they ended up having this hearing yesterday because the judge felt like he didn't have enough information from the defense to rule on this without basically just hearing Sam Bankman-Fried say whatever it was he was going to say. And so we sort of watched him do a portion of his defense as like a dress rehearsal, and then the judge was going to rule on whether or not he could actually do it for real in front of the jury. And so that's where we left off yesterday. And the judge had said yesterday that he was going to rule on it in the morning. And so he did. Quick aside, people want to know about my dog, my beloved, wonderful boy. I miss him terribly, and I feel terrible that I'm not going home to him. And I'm so mad at Sam Bankman-Fried for making it so that I can't give my dog a hug tonight. But my very needy, wonderful boy has one of my very good friends staying with him. And that very good friend, I owe him the like such a big favor or like a nice dinner or something, because not only was he willing to dog sit for me on about 5 hours notice on Wednesday, but he was also willing to extend the dog sitting through the weekend. So that's a hero. Shout out to my very good friend, who is also my dog Atlas loves this friend. And so Atlas, I'm sure, is having just a wonderful time. He went on a walk today, and what is going on up here? One thing I've learned recently is that Atlas is afraid of scarecrows. And so as various houses on our usual walking route have been decorating for fall, he's like, what is that? So that was a fun time today, where he walked past the scarecrow and was like, I don't think so. All right, so we're going to go back to actually talking about what I'm here to talk about, and not my beloved, beautiful boy. So yes, on the topic of this testimony that they went over yesterday. Oh, sorry, my back hurts. I've been sitting in a weird position all day. So yesterday there were basically 5 things that they were trying to cover, and I'm not going to enumerate them all, but basically the first thing they talked about was the document retention policy, which they wanted to bring up to basically argue that his signal auto deletion policies were reasonable, or at least not prohibited by this document auto deletion. And then there was stuff that was like loan documents, these like promissory notes that had been drafted by various lawyers with respect to the loans that Sam Bankman-Fried and various other executives had been taking to pay for venture investments and things like that. And then there were some other legal documents. FTX terms of service was one of them. And a payment processing agreement or something like that, that was between FTX and Alameda Research. And so those came up yesterday. And this morning, the judge basically said, you're allowed to talk about this document retention policy because it seems vaguely relevant to something. This whole topic of signal auto deletion has come up a lot. And whether, the prosecution is clearly trying to imply that he was, trying to hide things by using, this policy. His defense is really trying to say, like, there were some documents that he had to retain and he followed that policy. And so as long as he was following that policy, it was fine that they were just deleting signal chats. And, they're trying to give an alternate explanation so it doesn't look sketchy, which was basically like he was worried that someone would say something unguarded and it might leak and then it would look bad for the company. That's their story. Whether or not you believe it or not is up to you. But, there are plenty of innocuous reasons that people have signal chats auto-delete or use Signal at all. I think they've been trying to sort of imply that like Signal is a sketchy thing to be using, but like everyone should be using Signal. Anyway, even if you're not doing crimes, you should be using Signal. I see there's a question around if I was in the court or in the overflow. So I was trying to make up my mind last night over whether or not I wanted to wake up in the middle of the night and go camp out in front of the courtroom. I knew that people had been lining up. It's really funny. So is my sound out? Someone is saying my sound is out, but I can't tell if it's just for them. So hopefully you will all tell me if it is. I'm going to keep talking, though, assuming it's just a one-person problem. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, it's really funny. Some of the journalists are like they try to keep it really close to the chest, like what time they show up, because they don't want to basically let people know, and then everyone starts showing up at that time. But I was able to get it out of some people. I did promise I wouldn't announce it, but it was very early, far earlier than I love to wake up, which in fairness is not very early, but anyway, I ended up deciding at the last minute that I was going to not do that because I actually feel like I get a lot out of the overflow room. First of all, it's nice to be able to come and go. Like if I desperately needed a snack earlier this morning because I didn't have a chance to eat before I went in. And so like just being able to like pop out for a second and like wolf down a granola bar and then go back in is really nice. But also you get to see any exhibits that they bring up a lot more clearly than you really can in the courtroom, which is great. So the biggest like downfall is really that you can't see the jurors, and so you don't get a sense of whether or not they're reacting or how they're reacting or whatever. And you don't get to see the judge, but I don't know how much I'm really missing on that front. So that's that. What's the physical security vibes like? Oh yeah, so I forgot to talk about this yesterday. They're pretty intense about security there. So when you get to the courtroom, you get in this big line and you put all your stuff goes through an x-ray like in the airport, and you have to hand over any electronics. So for me, I was handing over my cell phone. I have Bluetooth headphones that were in my backpack that I really don't need to have with me, but I had them, and they didn't want me to have those, I guess, in case they could like record or something. I don't know. And then my laptop, obviously. And then, so they take those away and they give you like a little poker chip. It looks exactly like a poker chip, which I think is kind of funny. And then you go give it to a guy at a desk, and he gives you a number, and then you can get it back when it's lunchtime or at the end of the day. But other than that, you're allowed to bring stuff in. So like, my notebook and my water bottle and my, whatever else, doesn't really matter. I don't know about popcorn. I don't think you're supposed to eat in the overflow rooms, but they don't mind if you just step out and eat something, and you're allowed to have water. Although one of them, I think it depends a little bit on like which guy you get, because I think one of them didn't want you drinking anything that was like not a clear liquid. I don't know why. Maybe they were worried if you would like spill on the carpet. I don't know. Anyway. One thing that smartwatches are not allowed. They actually kicked someone out of the actual courtroom because he was wearing a smartwatch. So yeah, if you have a smartwatch, you have to take it off, which means that nobody ever seems to know what time it is. And anyone who has like an analog watch is like the coolest kid in the room. Someone said today that it's like the kid who had gum in middle school. Like everyone's like, what time is it? They do have clocks though in the actual courtroom. Oh, and yeah, so the question was like, how is Inner City Press live tweeting the trial, right? Because someone in person asked me this today. And they were like, has he been sneaking in a phone? And I was like, no, this guy has been doing this for years. Like he does not, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with him outside of the SBF trial, but he literally, this is like all he does. He goes to New York court hearings and he live tweets them, and like any of them. SBF, he's been doing the Trump ones to some extent. He like runs back and forth between him. I do not know how this guy has the time, but anyway, he is not sneaking in a phone. He is not doing sign language to someone standing outside. Basically, there are special journalists who routinely cover the cases in these particular courts, and they get access to a separate room basically, and they are allowed to have their devices. And so he is one of those special few who, like, because this is his whole thing, that's what he does. And so he's able to tweet and stuff like that. I did talk to Michael Lewis today. I was in one overflow room this morning. I was put into the one on the 23rd floor. And he ended up he was sitting in the pew basically directly in front of me. And so I said hi, and he said hi, and it's nice to see me, and thanks for coming on my podcast. And I said, yeah, of course. And then I tried to pick his brain a little bit on how he felt the trial was going. But they had just started talking in the courtroom at that point, and he was like, that's too long of an answer for me to give you right now, because we weren't supposed to be talking really. So I didn't get that. And then I got really hungry, like I said, because I hadn't eaten. And so I eventually like couldn't take it anymore, or I was like worried my stomach was going to make a loud noise. And so I left the courtroom to just like quickly eat a Cliff Bar in the hallway. And then I got locked out, and I was like, oh no. So I ended up going to the 24th floor because I knew there was another overflow room there. and I went into the overflow room there, which was not locked. And I actually got a better seat. And then the coolest thing happened, which was that, so I think I mentioned this yesterday, but like there's the pews basically where most of us sit, and there's one big TV screen, and you have to really squint to see it. And like hopefully you get to be in the front row or like near the front row and you can see it, but otherwise you can't see it very well. But then there's the juror box, because these are all just like extra courtrooms, so they're laid out like a normal courtroom. And so if you get there early, but not so early that you're actually in the courtroom, you get to sit in the juror box, and there are comfier seats. They're padded. It's not like, because they're like wooden pews, like in a church. But the juror box has comfier seats, and then each person, or roughly, some of them are 2-to-1 screen, but each person gets a monitor. And so partway through the morning, there was a woman who had gotten to sit in that jury box who came out and then came up to me, and she's like, "Are you Molly?" And I was like, "Yes." And she was like, I don't know, I forget what she said. She said something about recognizing my work or something like that. And then she's like, "I'm leaving for the day. You can take my spot." And I was like, yes. So that was cool. I got to sit in the like little jury box, and I got my own screen, and it was much easier to see. And actually, on that point, the lighting is, I mentioned this yesterday, the lighting is really bad. And so Sam Bankman-Fried looked like ghostly white, and I could barely see him. And I was his hair looked really weird. I was like, I think his hair is parted down the middle, which like was crazy, right? Just like a weird look. Well, anyway, the special jury box meant that I had a better view and I could see him better, and it was like less washed out. His hair is not parted down the middle. So that was just like a problem with the screen. I apologize for fake news on that particular front. It is cut short, but it is just, it looks normal. It looks like someone with fairly curly hair has a short haircut, which like, okay. Okay. I think that's the details about the overflow room that I wanted to cover. Yeah. So yeah, he doesn't have like a funny middle part, which would be funny, but he does not. He looks very normal. He definitely has lost some weight. So I don't know, and I don't know how recent that is. It could be that he lost weight a couple months ago, and I just haven't seen many pictures of him. Like there's a handful of pictures of him coming and going from pretrial hearings where they're never flattering pictures. I feel like the photographers who take those pictures they get like the fisheye lens, and it always just looks really weird, and he's always like making a face or something. So like it's hard to say exactly how he looked. But he definitely is, trimmer than he was. But besides that, he looks kind of how he's always looked. I don't know. He's clean shaven. Sometimes he had stubble and stuff in like the pretrial hearings, but he's clean shaven. All right. Let me just make sure I caught up to everything else. I don't think he's cute. I'm sorry. He's not my type. Especially after just hearing testimony about what an absolutely god-awful boyfriend he is. I don't think so. Oh yeah, and then about the Adderall, someone just asked that. After this, I'm gonna go right into his testimony, but he did get the Adderall situation has been resolved. He is on an extended release dose of Adderall now. And so there was an issue where like he initially was supposed to be getting 4 doses a day of the like quick release or instant release, or I don't know, whatever it is. And he was only getting like 1 super early in the morning that was basically worn off by the time he got to talk to his lawyers. And then 1 like when he got back to jail at nighttime. And so it was just like completely inadequate. So now he has the extended release, and there have been no complaints since then. So hopefully it's working well. He seemed very normal on the stand. He didn't seem, distracted. He didn't seem really amped up or anything like that. He definitely he fidgets a little bit, but it seems like he's reining that in. So he will occasionally do, he'll do this type of thing, but like he usually stops, and it's not super, it's not super distracting or anything. He's pretty well composed. Um, and he talks in this way that he always has talked, which is rambling, verbose. He puts in a lot of caveats, where he'll say, like, I'm going to answer the question I think you're asking, or let me try to answer that, or I apologize if I'm not being responsive to the question. Like, he does a lot of that kind of stuff, which is how he's always been, I think. So, okay, I'm going to go back to talking about what actually happened. So, like I mentioned, they were allowed to question him around the document retention policy, but the other things were out, because basically the judge said, like, the question here is, did he do fraud? Did he steal this money? It was not, was there, a document of this loan? Because the question is really like, where did the loan money come from? Not like, did the loan exist or something like that. And so he basically felt like it was going to be, if they started bringing that stuff in, the possibility for confusion and prejudice would outweigh any potential probative value of those types of documents. And so, and he was like, I frankly don't think it's relevant at all, that lawyers were involved in like writing up some documents here that don't really have anything to do with the actual alleged crimes. There was one slightly weird moment where the the defense tried to raise what Mark Cohen described as a standing objection to, I think it was to using testimony from yesterday. I didn't quite hear it that clearly, and so actually, let me just quickly look. I have the transcript in my inbox, and I know it's going to be right at the beginning, so I'm going to just quickly double check that, because that was kind of a weird moment. Control F, standing. Yeah. So he said, we like a standing objection to use of this transcript. Let me just see. Yeah. So first, I think there was a conversation before I was there, or I think even maybe before they started the whole thing, where basically the defense didn't want the prosecution to be able to reference the transcript. And I don't believe the judge allowed that, but they were like, we want to have a standing objection to this, like, for the record, that anytime they do that, we just assume that we object. And Kaplan was like, there's no such thing as a standing objection. You can't just like say that, and you just have to object if you have an objection. So he really like started off the day by scolding the defense, which is like, oof, that's not a great start. And then they also, that's not really relevant. So, I've been using a Pilot G7 pen, I think. I actually lost my good pen today. I must have dropped it. And so I like the 0.7 millimeter ones, and I had to use a 0.5. So it's really scratchy, and I was very upset about that. But we'll have to, I'll see if I can get a new one. Okay, so let's go into his direct. So they kicked off, and the first question was basically, what was your vision for FTX? Or I think they had a couple really background questions of like, what year did you start FTX and that kind of thing. But the first substantive question was like, what was your vision for FTX? And so he was trying to like, I think, give him the opportunity to say, he had these lofty goals of moving the crypto world forward and, filling this gap that was so desperately needed to be filled and all that kind of thing. And then they sort of went into, so what happened? Like, what went wrong? And he sort of previewed what what he's been trying to say, which is basically that FTX was a futures exchange. That's what the name stands for. And because of that, people were using margin, they were trading futures positions. And so there is this inherent risk when you're doing that you could lose money, or even that other customers could lose money, and then it could be clawed back from you. And so, whoopsie, there goes $8 billion, which I think is not a convincing story, but it's the one that he's going with. And it's really, I think, the one that he's got, which is, yeesh. And so then the judge, or the defense counsel basically said, did you make any mistakes? To give him the opportunity to basically do the I fucked up thing that he was doing shortly after the collapse. And he said, yeah, he really should have had a risk management team. He should have had a chief risk officer. There were significant oversights. He was doing that whole thing. Then they spent a long time talking about his background. Where'd you go to college? Where'd you grow up? Who did you, of all these people that you eventually hired, which, you went to MIT with some of them, and you met some of them at Jane Street. And, there was this whole background thing, which if you have read about Sam Bankman-Fried, you already know, but they're just putting that out there for the jury to sort of establish, like, look how smart he is. And, they asked about his, living situation at MIT, which was basically it was a fraternity, but like not in the like woo keg stand fraternity way that like a lot of people think of fraternities, because they did not use the word fraternity. They used the word co-ed living environment or something like that, which made it sound like some sort of like care home, I thought. But anyway, and they asked him to describe this nerdy frat that he was in. I immediately just pictured, what's that movie with the nerdy frat? Was it like Animal House or something like that? Anyway, he said that basically Epsilon Theta was, the tagline was co-ed, nerdy, and dry. And that there were lots of board games, no drinking, which like, oh, what a cute nerd, I guess, is the story there. But everyone in the overflow room was like, oh my God, it was just like such a clear attempt to appeal to the jury and be like, he doesn't drink, so clearly he can't steal money. So someone said, you think all the MIT frats are like that? Let me just make sure you're responding. No, so yeah, someone said, you think all the MIT frats are nerd frats? I went to school in Boston. That's not true. Those MIT kids can drink. Yeah, there was all these questions about Jane Street and all these things he learned there. Was he trained there? Did he learn about front running there? Did this, what did they teach you about risk? Blah, 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 blah. Where did he work? Which desk did he work at? Etc. And it was very dry. It was just like a snooze fest, honestly. They sort of moved forward into when he started Alameda Research. He was so excited about crypto. There seemed like there was all this demand, but the infrastructure was bad. And so he started it out with, they asked him how he funded it originally, which he said it was basically some of his own money that he had kept from his job at Jane Street. And then he said loans from friends. He did not go into the fact that these loans from friends were from very relatively wealthy, effective altruists. I think partly because they're limited to what extent they're allowed to talk about effective altruism, but like loans from friends is maybe not the whole story as far as where that money came from. To what extent did his answers seem coached? They were definitely coached, but I think everyone's answers are coached. It didn't seem too unnatural. But it was clear that he was coached for sure. His parents are not gonna testify, I don't think. That seems really unlikely to me. I don't know how his parents were reacting because I was not, again, in the courtroom physically, and so I couldn't see them. I did run into them. I have run into them a couple of times, actually. Yesterday, I saw them leaving the courthouse. This morning, they were in line behind me in the security line. Joe Bankman is like, honestly, like in any other circumstance, I would be like, wow, what a nice old man. Or not even old. He's not old. He's late 60s. I said yesterday that I thought they were pushing 80. I was off by about a decade. He's maybe like 68 or so, 69 maybe. Nice. But he's like just this very affable guy who's like chatting with the person next to him and like just shooting the shit. And Barbara Fried is more buttoned up, I think. But then I ran into him again. I had come out of the overflow room for a second, and he, for some reason, it was during one of the breaks, and he was for some reason on my floor, which was weird because I think the courtroom is on like 2 floors up. But anyway, he held the door for me. So they're there. He honestly, his demeanor is like he's clearly keeping it together better than I would be if I was in his position. So more power to him, I guess. But all right. Da, 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 da. Yeah, they can't stop him from testifying. It's his right to testify. They can limit what he's allowed to talk about, and that is clearly what they've done. But I think the judge probably is happy to have him testify. That's right. Joe Bankman stole my pen. I know it now. He's like, this will stop her from reporting. You're wondering if the case applies specifically to SBF stealing / misusing / commingling customer fiat, or if it's also crypto. It's both. It's definitely both. Any feeling that his team did not want him up there? It didn't come across that way. I am pretty sure that they don't want him testifying, but there was nothing in the way that they were asking questions or whatever that made me think that, that made it seem like they didn't want him there. Can he still choose to not testify in the actual trial? This is the actual trial. So yesterday they were doing a hearing without the jury present, but today the jury was there. This was the real deal. This is it. I did wonder, though. There was part of me that was like, I might show up tomorrow and he will have realized overnight that testifying is a terrible idea. I didn't think that was that likely, because it's like, if he was going to be convinced that testifying was a bad idea, like he would have been convinced of that already, but it did cross my mind. Boop-de-boo. Earlier, it was established that SBF did not code, but you read that at Alameda, he developed an algorithm to make money from the different prices of BTC at various exchanges. Yeah, so you're thinking, what you're referring to is this trade that he supposedly made early on in Alameda Research's existence, where he was arbitraging the price of Bitcoin. So the idea was like, you could buy Bitcoin for $10,000 on one exchange, but then on another exchange, potentially in a different jurisdiction, like South Korea or something like that, you could buy or sell Bitcoin for like $11,000. And so if you basically set up a system to buy the Bitcoin at $10,000 and then sell it on a different exchange for $11,000, you could potentially make a lot of money. That's what they're referring to. He didn't develop, it's just an arb trade. Like, he didn't develop the idea of that, but that is supposedly how he made some of his early money at Alameda Research. But you're right, he's not a coder, and he's not a software developer. Like, that was not his side of things. He was like the business guy. All right, just going to catch up on chat and then I'll go back to it. Someone asked, do you think he helped or hurt his defense today? I would say, if anything, he helped it a little bit. But like I said, it was all his team asking him questions today. So like it would be bad if he was hurting his defense today. Although not unexpected. But no, I think he helped it a little bit. And I'll go into how I think that in a minute. But he came off as, I don't know, he came off as like evasive in some cases and definitely verbose, but not like cagey or malicious or anything like that. And some of, he did present sort of an alternative theory for some of the stuff that we've heard already, which again, I'll go into in a second. Will this go all the way to the political donations he was making? So yes and no. He was originally charged with one campaign finance charge. It was ultimately dropped because of a dispute between the Bahamas and the US over whether or not they were allowed to charge him on something that was not included in the charges that they had extradited him on. So that charge was dropped, but they are using the evidence related to campaign finance violations to basically argue the wire fraud charge. So yes and no. He's not being charged on that specifically, but it is a part of the wrongdoing because you're still not allowed to do that. That said, Nishad Singh was charged with a campaign finance violation. And I want to say Ryan Salem was too, although I can't remember 100% for sure that was true. So some of the other people involved were charged on that. Will I be attending the Celsius trials? It is too early for me to say that. I think they'll be interesting if it goes to trial, which again, there's a long time between now and I think it's scheduled for like a year from now. So like Mashinsky could take a plea, in which case like there won't be a trial to go to. But if there is one, I might, because that seems interesting too. Someone asked about if Cross is going to point out that he was aware of the massive hole in the balance sheet but continued to spend. I can't really predict it, but I suspect there's very little chance that they will just omit that. No, he did not get cross-examined today. So the defense is not finished with their direct questioning. The judge had to pin him down a little bit on, I got to go to the back of my notes, on how long they think they still need to question him. So some of Monday will certainly be devoted to that. Let me just find that. Okay, so the defense estimated another couple of hours of direct, and he thought that they should be done by 11:30 on Monday at the latest. We'll see if that works out. Cohen had also said that he thought that the entire defense questioning would take 4 or 5 hours, and it took all of today. So now he's saying that let's see, they start at 9:30. He's saying he's going to need another 2 hours on Monday, but we'll see. Yeah, it's Ryan Salem, not Salami, unfortunately, because I think it would be funnier if it was Salami. Am I aiming to be in the courtroom? I'm not sure yet. I might try to do it for Cross, but we'll see. Just trying to be there that early just seems painful. There are definitely people who've been doing it, like Tiffany Fong, if any of you know her. She's like sort of a crypto influencer turned journalist. She's been doing a lot of videos on this stuff. I think she's really fascinating, and she's done some great work on this. Anyway, she's been there early, like yesterday and today. And I'm like, how are you walking at this point? Like, I was practically falling asleep today, and I woke up at 7. Like, she's been up since 2. Show us your notes. You want to see my shorthand. The one thing that's really funny is how badly my handwriting degrades over the course of a day. So like at the beginning of it, it's very neat. Like this was probably early on in one of the, I think this was today. And then by the end of the day, let me find a good example. It got a little better after we came back from the break. That's one thing I will say. Did I miss a page? What's going on here? Oh, that's weird. I like missed pages partway through. Yeah, anyway, it starts to look more like this by the end of the day where I'm like crossing things out and I'm abbreviating way more, but you know, we're making it work. Also, I have like by the end of the day, I have this like red spot bruise on my finger. Someone asked how much longer I'm staying, so I'm going to be staying through Tuesday. So before this week, I think it was last weekend. Time is a blur right now. Last weekend, I think it was when I decided I was going to see if I could try to make it down, and I made this like bet that I thought he was going to testify starting on Monday and going into Tuesday, and so I was like, it's going to be quick. And so Monday and Tuesday are the days I'm going to try to be there. So I booked a refundable plane ticket to come down. And then on Wednesday, when there was the telephone conference about testifying, I learned that he was going to start testifying. They thought he was going to start testifying on Thursday, which technically he did, but it was just the hearing. And so I decided to fly down like that next day. Or no, it was that night that I flew down. So I actually still have the plane tickets that I had originally booked. And so I'm just going to use that return flight ticket on Tuesday to go home. So I booked another 4 days in a hotel just the weekend and then Monday into Tuesday. Well, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. And so I'll be going home on Tuesday night after the trial. So fingers crossed. Tiffany Fong. Was she the one that Sam told his altruism was a scam? No, you're thinking of Kelsey Piper, who was the Vox journalist. Tiffany Fong is, she originally was in crypto. She had put money into Celsius and basically got screwed over by the Celsius bankruptcy. And so she started, I think somehow she got access to like a leaked something from Celsius, and that's how people started to know her, is that she like published a leaked thing. But then like when everything went down with FTX, she just like decided to shoot her shot with Sam and see if he would give her an interview. And he said yes. And so she got this phone interview with Sam and she published portions of it to YouTube. And that was where it first became apparent that he was making like dark political donations. And there were a bunch of questions that she asked him, like about whether or not he was ignoring his lawyers, and he said basically fuck lawyers. And so like she got some good scoops on that, and she's been following the trial pretty closely. And now she just sort of covers crypto stuff, and I think she has a Substack and she does YouTube and all that kind of stuff. So she's initially like a crypto person, but she, like a fair number of people who were into crypto and maybe are still into crypto, she has interesting reporting on it, I guess. And she's funny. And she's really sweet. She gave me a big hug when I first saw her. Oh yeah, and she was on CoffeeZilla. CoffeeZilla used some of her report, like some of her interview, and then I think actually had her on for like a special interview too. Okay, I don't want to be getting super derailed because I want to keep talking about this. So I wish I could like put a pin in the chat to get back to it. Oh, thanks for the tip on the plane ticket. I definitely don't want them to cancel the return if I don't show up for the outbound. But the outbound's not till Sunday, so I have some time. Okay, cool. I am going to ignore the chat for a hot minute, and I'll catch up on it in a minute. Okay, so then they started talking about they wanted to know about why the office was based in Hong Kong. I think maybe to try to scoot around some of the implications that they were just trying to avoid regulations. And they also asked why basically he moved from Hong Kong to the Bahamas, which he was like, I actually moved to the Bahamas because they have regulations there and we wanted to be regulated. Look how legitimate we were. So we'll see how much people buy into that, but that was the point. And then they basically said, he basically said that he wanted to move out of Hong Kong, partly because of COVID restrictions were really fucking them over. Because for a long time with Hong Kong, if you came into the country, you had to quarantine in a hotel room for 3 weeks. And so it was like impossible for employees to come and go because they would have to do that. And it was really hard for them to do in-person job interviews because like no one is going to do a 3-week quarantine to do a 1-day interview. And then he also said that there were basically like political disputes with China going on that was making things challenging. And so he wanted to move, and the Bahamas seemed like a reasonable place to go. So that's one thing I will say just in general is like it seemed very clear to me from a high level that today was really, I felt like they were sort of on the back foot today, where they spent a lot of time just responding to various arguments or implications even that the prosecution has made, and not as much time sort of developing their own narrative. Like they just, it felt like they were it felt like they were jumping around a lot, and like they were going through sort of a list of things that had come up in previous parts of the prosecution's case to try to go back and say like, oh, no, we have a different version of events. And it was very disjointed. They would move from topic to topic. They would occasionally jump around time periods in sort of weird ways. So like they would start talking about something that was in June of 2022, and then they would move forward and start talking about something that happened in September of 2022, and then they would go back to talking about June 2022. And like there was even one point where the judge was like, wait a minute, I'm confused about the timing. Why are you jumping around like this? So it was definitely disjoint. Not necessarily because I think some of it was Sam Bankman-Fried's fault in the sense that like they would ask him a question about June, he would answer it, and then he would keep talking. This is a theme. He would like answer the question and then keep talking. But he would like keep talking to the point that now he was talking about things that were happening later on, and then they would have to try to like go back to June or whatever so that they were it felt like they were jumping around, even though the questions were all about the same time period. It was just the answers had gotten really moved around. I've just noticed my laptop's not plugged in, so let me quickly do that. Ding. Okay, now I can talk as long as I want. All right, I'll keep going a little bit more and then I'll go back to the chat. So they talked a little bit about the housing in the Bahamas, which was a big point that the prosecution was trying to hammer on, was that like, look at this fancy ass apartment they were renting. He described it as a housing complex. I mean, it was a resort is how I would describe it. He did say though that it was also a vacation spot, so points to him for honesty there. He said he wanted to live with 10 people because it replicated his college living situation, which I thought made him sound kind of juvenile, but maybe that was the point. Yeah, again, to the point where it felt like they were just responding to the prosecution's points here. After they've been talking, first they're talking about moving from Hong Kong to the Bahamas, then they talk about the housing in the Bahamas, like, okay, that makes sense. And then suddenly they bring up a previous exhibit from the prosecution. I forget when they showed this. It was at some point when they were questioning maybe Gary Wong or Nishad Singh, where it's just a photo of him that they put up at one point, and he's holding a deck of cards in his hand, like playing cards. Um, and so it was like it had nothing to do with what they were talking about as far as the Bahamas, but they wanted to basically at the time that the prosecution brought that up, um, there was an objection from the defense where they said that, this is outrageous. It makes it look like he's gambling, like they're just trying to prejudice the jury, blah blah blah. And the judge, I think, eventually they allowed the photo, but now they've come back to it to try to be like, to try to make it seem like it was innocuous, which it seems like a weird thing to dwell on. Like I doubt the jurors really remembered it that much, and now they're just bringing it up again. But like, whatever. I'm not a defense lawyer, but his answer around why he was holding cards was that he compulsively fidgets, which that's, I think, known at this point. And for a period of time, his preferred fidget object was playing cards. He would shuffle or futz around with playing cards. He said he would go through a deck of cards a week, which is like, my man, what were you doing? And then eventually decided to start using fidget spinners, which was, I guess, less wasteful or something. But then they asked him these questions. Did you ever play poker? And he said no, or not in a long time, or something like that. And then they asked him, did you ever go to Las Vegas? And I think at this point, the prosecution objected and the judge sustained the objection. But like they were really just like trying to be like, doesn't it seem like the prosecution was being ridiculous and asking those questions? So I thought that was kind of a funny point. All right, I'm going to go back to chat for a hot second. All right, I think I'm back to where I left off. Body language of the jury, no idea because I was not in the juror room. Am I doing finance journalism full time? Kind of. I am doing my Substack full time, and my Web3 is going to great site full time. On that note, I really need to update that. Being offline all day does not help me keep up with what's going on in the news. And like I think I mentioned this yesterday, but I have a fellowship with Harvard that is actually ending on Tuesday, the same day that I go home. It was just a year-long thing that started last November, and so it ends the last day of October. And I'm gonna take the next 2 months of the year. I get the last 2 months of the year and just sort of do the blog and stuff that I've been doing without trying to pick up something new, and then just see how that works out financially and if that's tenable. And then if it's not, I will either actually get a real job or do freelance software or something like that. But either way, I'm going to keep doing this. It's just a question of if I will only be doing this. Do I think that all the answers? Oh, it's a question of whether or not he wanted to testify or whether his lawyers wanted him to. I think it's pretty clear that the decision to testify was Sam's. So far, there has been no mention of the house that he bought for his parents in the Bahamas. I am pretty sure it will come up in cross. I would be surprised if the defense brings it up. Whoop. Why does this jump around like this? What is a fellowship for the undereducated? It's a fancy way of saying that. It can mean like a million different things, and so it's just like a way to say that like there's someone that we're paying for some reason. Basically, they were just supporting me in the work that I have been doing, and also some of the research that I was doing. I did a seminar series for Harvard. I've done some, what's the word I'm looking for? talks basically for Harvard as a part of it. But most of it was they were like, we like the work that you've been doing. We think you should be able to keep doing it. How can we help? Which was awesome of them. It was extremely lucky. Like, it's not every day that someone shows up and is like, hey, we want to pay you for what you've been doing for free. Because at this point, when they contacted me, I didn't even have the paid Substack or anything like that. So that was really nice. But yeah, lucky. Very grateful for that. Am I going to be covering the trial in NYC? So I've already mentioned this before, but I'm in New York right now, and I will be here until Tuesday. All right, I think I'm going to jump back into this. Oh, actually, no. So someone literally just asked this. What became of the Slack channel that was called Wire Fraud? I've been meaning to come back to this because this sort of came up in the live stream yesterday. So there was a point during the defense's cross-examination of the last prosecution witness, who was the FBI guy who was testifying about this document he made that listed all of the signal chats. And the defense on cross-examination started going down this route where they were asking, like, wasn't this document created by the prosecution team? Weren't they the ones deciding what to include and exclude? And they started to very heavily imply that the prosecution was like improperly excluding signal chats from this document, in order to paint a false negative narrative about Sam Bankman-Fried. And they ended up having this sidebar about this, which you can read during the sidebar in the transcript, but when you're in there, if you're in person in the courtroom or if you're in the overflow room, you can't hear it. There's no way of hearing it. And so when I did the live stream yesterday, I didn't know why they had that sidebar, but they got back from the sidebar and they ended up striking not only the witness's response, but the actual question around, like, the one that suggested that they had excluded things. And I was like, man, I wonder what that was about. Well, I read the transcript last night. It turns out that the prosecution did exclude some chats from this exhibit. It was the wire fraud signal chat. And there was another one too. Let me pull up the transcript because the other one had also just like a bananas name. I think it was like fake website or something like that, which made me wonder if it was about the North Dimension website, which North Dimension is this entity that they set up to process payments. It was like between when they were just getting them from Alameda and before they were going to FTX, there was like this period of time where they were going through this entity called North Dimension, and it hasn't come up yet in the trial, but there was like a fake website for North Dimension that made them look like an electronics retailer or something like that. And so I'm wondering if that's what this was referring to. Okay, yeah, I've got the transcript right here. So basically what happened is they have this sidebar after they're asking these questions around. So the question just before the sidebar is, do you recall ever an instance where they may have told you to exclude a group being a signal chat? And there's an objection, and they asked to do it in the sidebar. And the prosecutor says to the judge in the sidebar that, yes, they did ask for certain groups to be removed, and it was because the defense asked them to, because they couldn't reach a stipulation on some of the groups. And so they, just to move things along so they could go forward with it, they redacted any of these signal chats that had the word fraud in the name, because the defense felt like the names that had those words in them were overly prejudicial. And so there was a group called Wire Fraud, and there was a group called Fake Fraud Site. And so the prosecution was like, this is stupid that they're implying that we were improperly hiding things when they were the ones who asked us to do that. And so that was why they struck that question, which is like, oh my God, what were they thinking? So I don't know if they forgot or what, but that was bonkers. So, all right. Bum, bum. Where can we find the transcripts? I mentioned this yesterday. Transcripts have a 90-day restriction period, and so you can only access them in the first 90 days by either going physically to the courthouse and looking at them on these terminals where you can't print them out, or buying them from the court reporters. And it's, I think, kind of a racket maybe, but it's how court reporters make their money. And so you would have to buy them, and they're expensive. I mentioned that they were expensive yesterday, and I just want to give you an idea. I think it's per page. And so they're like usually between $150 to $300 per day, depending on how long the day is. But yeah. But I think after that 90-day restriction period, I think they go on Pacer at that point, which means then you can either pay for them and it's 10 cents a page up to $3, and then they cap it at $3, even if it's longer than that. Or ideally, they go on Court Listener, which is like one person pays for them and then they share them on Court Listener. And so you will hopefully be able to get them for free, but it will be a 90-day period. Just trying to make sure the chat like jumps around in a really weird way, and so I'm sorry if I'm jumping around also. There we go. I'm back where I'm supposed to be. Any criminal consequences for the people involved in SBF's lobbying efforts? So far, there have been no charges. Whether or not there will be, I obviously cannot predict. It certainly seems like they were doing some shady things, if not criminal things. I think the problem is there's sort of this question between like, someone can be doing a criminal thing and not get charged for it because it's sort of a matter of like resources and what the prosecutors want to prioritize. So who's to know? There we go. My phone was hiding. Okay. Is Sam still at MDC Brooklyn? Yes, he is. So they drive him there in the morning, and then they drive him there a little early so he can meet with his defense team, and then I think he maybe gets to meet with them after too. I forget, but yeah, he is otherwise at MDC Brooklyn. My new ring light. So it's actually not a ring light. I think I mentioned this at the beginning. I am basically filming this from my sink, and they have this fancy mirror in here where the mirror lights up. And so, see, I just have the mirror turned on, and the mirror has like a light around the outside that is very much like a ring light. You can see it in the reflection from the door. So thank you, hotel, for giving me this like Instagram influencer light. Almost caught up at this point. How many pages is today's transcript? It is. Well, I've already lost it. There it is. Today's transcript was 220 pages long, which is pretty average. Anything about the advertising? I will get to that. Could a campaign finance charge be brought up at a later date if something is worked out with the Bahamas? I don't know, honestly. Even if it could, I doubt that it will be, because the campaign finance charge was not the most serious charge by any stretch of the charges that they have brought. Like there's like all these wire fraud charges, and then it's like the campaign finance charge. And I forget what the max sentence on that was, but it's like, it just seems at that point they would be like really bouncing the rubble, I think is the term I would use. Like it just seems not worth the the effort. Who is this person talking to? Yeah, I worry about that. I have heard a couple of people walk by talking and I can hear them talking very clearly, which means that I know that people in the hallway can hear me just talking. So hopefully no one's like, "Can you shut up?" Okay, I'm gonna go back to my notes. So we just finished talking about the photo with the cards. Now, spicy, they start talking about the romance with Caroline Ellison. They ask if he was romantically involved with her. He says yes. When did they date? How long did they date? He says the same thing that she did, which was that they dated on and off for 2 years. They asked why they broke up, and he said that he didn't have the time or the energy for the relationship with her, and that basically she wanted more out of it than he was willing to give, which seems clear from everything that we've read. I think there was some coaching involved here where he was sort of trying to portray himself as like this poor nerdy guy who can't sustain a relationship and oh, isn't that so sad? And he said something like, generally he's struggled to maintain romantic relationships, and it's like, oh, poor guy, like, come on. They also wanted to ask about whether or not he and Caroline ever talked about philosophy together, which maybe is a response to some of the questions or some of the prosecution's commentary around like his coin flip example, where he was like, where she basically said that he was willing to take really outsized risks if there was a potential for a bigger reward. So, she testified to say that like he once told her that he would be willing to flip a coin that had a chance, if it came up tails, to destroy the world. If on the flip side, if it came up heads, there was a more than 50% chance it would, if it came up heads, it would improve the world by like more than twice as much or something like that. It was like this really extreme example of like, yeah, he's totally willing to just take any risk, And so I think that's why they brought this up. But he basically said that it was actually Caroline who generally initiated those philosophy conversations. And the way that it usually went is that she would state some opinion, usually contrarian on some philosophical topic, and then they would debate it, which like, boy, that sounds fun. Not serious. But yeah, Caroline Ellison was also a weirdo, to put it bluntly. Like I think she came off as pretty empathetic on the stand, but like some of her writing that she's done in the past, like she's a weirdo. She has this Tumblr that I think has been pretty much verified to be hers, where she makes some very contrarian points. She writes about race science. She writes about how she thinks that ideal relationships should operate sort of like a Chinese harem, where they're basically a polyamorous relationship and all partners are constantly vying for the top spot. I mean, like she was big on saying edgy stuff. She was like anti-feminist stuff about how like men were superior. I mean, she reminds me of sort of like the 4chan edgelord girl who like is trying to be cool and like fit in by being edgy and taking controversial and sometimes like self-deprecating opinions. So it gives me the ick, but I think that, when he said that Caroline Ellison would state an opinion usually contrarian, like that sounds plausible. So let me just scroll back. Dan Friedberg only came up once today. That's correct, and I'll get to it. I think it was also in a very passing manner. It was not particularly meaningful. So I don't think the judge instructed that he couldn't bring him up. I think we would know if the judge had made that instruction because it would either be in the transcript or in some letter, like written opinion. I think it's just they were so hamstrung on what they were allowed to talk about as far as legal opinions, that just there wasn't an opportunity to talk about him. Was she a teenager when she wrote this stuff? She was younger. I don't think she was a teenager though. I mean, she was probably in college or something, like early 20s, I think maybe. Like younger, but she's only 28 right now, so she was an adult when she wrote them. Okay, I'm going back to my notes now. So they asked about to what extent Caroline Ellison would basically report to him on what was going on at Alameda. They brought up a balance sheet. Oh yeah, they wanted him to testify to how Caroline Ellison would prepare these balance sheets, and there were so many objections on this point, because Sam Bankman-Fried is not Caroline Ellison, and so he can't necessarily testify to what was going through her head when she was making these balance sheets. And so Cohen tried to like come at it edgewise a couple of different ways. He kept trying to lay the foundation, but then the defense or the prosecution was objecting to all the ways that he was trying to lay this foundation, because like it's a hard thing to, like, Sam can't talk for her. And so eventually he asked, like, did you ever prepare balance sheets? And maybe you use the same process, but even that got nowhere. And so I think they eventually kind of gave up on that line of questioning. All right, and now they got to the marketing thing. So I know someone asked about the ads and whether or not they started talking about Larry David and Tom Brady and stuff. So they did spend a decent amount of time today talking about marketing, because I think because the prosecution spent so much time trying to portray it as this like egregious overspending. And I actually thought they did a pretty good job on the marketing point today. Like, I'll give them that one. They first they started to talk a little bit about how he thought about marketing, and he basically said that towards the beginning of FTX he was very skeptical. He was always very skeptical of like what he called performance marketing, which he then said he believed to mean Facebook and Google ads that were like, try FTX. He was like, he never felt like those were effective, I think just based on his own personal experience or something like that. But he did feel like maybe brand marketing or partnerships or sponsorships would be promising. And so they started to talk about some of those sponsorship opportunities. They brought up some of the exhibits that the government had used during questioning of various other witnesses that had like the list of sponsorship deals. And they really tried to hone in on the FTX Arena thing, because the FTX Arena came up several times during the prosecution's case where they were trying to say that, like, look, he spent, I forget what the total amount was, but it was $100+ million on this FTX Arena naming deal. Wasn't that so egregious? You know, that was so much money to be spending, which, yes, $100 million is a lot of money. But the defense came back around today and said that, to be very clear, those hundreds of millions of dollars were over a period of 19 years. And so it actually worked out to something like $10 million a year. So that does seem more reasonable, especially compared to some of the other spending where it was like, wasn't it like $50 million for like some amount of Tom Brady's time or something like that? It's like, oh, that's kind of a good deal. And he actually made I thought, a really good point about arenas and name recognition, where he was like, people don't remember TV ads. You know, he brought up some, I think it was like Sleep Number. He was like, he had seen some ad before that was played before like every football game about Sleep Number. And he like asked everyone he knew who watched football if they remembered that ad, and they said no. But then he realized that like everyone knows the named arenas, like the Staples Center. I mean, I'm not a sports person, so I don't know that many, but like I know Gillette Stadium, which is in Massachusetts. Like, there are named arenas, and people just know the name of the company. And so if you want people to just recognize the name of your company, that's not a bad way of doing it. And I thought he actually made a pretty good point there, personally. So, and this is a fun little like tidbit that has nothing to do with the case, but I thought was just interesting. So when they talked about the FTX arena, which was the Miami Heat arena, the basketball team, they mentioned that there were several other arenas in the running when they were looking to buy the naming rights to an arena, because obviously you can't just go and buy the naming rights to the Gillette Stadium because Gillette has probably signed a multi-year deal. But the ones that were available when they were interested in doing this were the stadiums for the New Orleans Saints, the Kansas City Chiefs, the Kansas City Royals, which is a baseball team, and then, of course, Miami Heat. And so he said that they investigated the possibility of doing the New Orleans Saints Stadium and the Kansas City Chiefs Stadium, but for various reasons, I think they were already in pretty advanced talks with other people or something like that, and so those didn't go through. And then he sort of dissed the Royals, where he said, frankly, we didn't want to be known as the Kansas City Royals of crypto exchanges, which I thought was pretty brutal. I'm not a baseball fan. I don't know what their reputation is, but I can kind of infer. And so, yeah, he said that he felt like $10 million a year for name recognition felt like a fairly good use of expenses. It was something like 1% of their revenue. And overall, they were spending 10 to 20% of their revenue on marketing, which he said he felt like was reasonable. So I don't do marketing. I don't know, but he thought it was reasonable. Okay. And so there was more on that. Yeah, so he testified, obviously, that he believed that the funds were coming from Alameda Research's revenue and their venture investments. They were basically saying he didn't think it was customer funds. They asked about the Solana investment. He said he was involved in due diligence, had calls with some of the leadership. He wanted to go into more detail on this, and they pulled him right back because the prosecution objected to the amount of detail he was going into about like what an awesome blockchain Solana is, I guess. So he just said that ultimately they invested. And just in general, he believed that all of these investments were also funded with profits from Alameda Research or loans from the borrow-lend desks, which I guess that was allowed. I don't know. I assume he didn't just testify to the fact that he was misusing loans, but I don't know. They asked about the fact that he was borrowing the money to make these investments. And he said he believed that, as the owner of Alameda Research, he believed that Alameda Research had billions of dollars in profits. And so he felt like he could pull from that. That I think is going to come up a lot, where he's like, I thought they were profitable. I assumed that the money that I was taking was from their profits, and you can't prove otherwise, I think is really sort of the tactic at this point. They talked about some of the properties in the Bahamas, not about his parents' property. There's no way I think the defense would willingly bring that up themselves, although I'm sure it will come up on cross. But he was saying that the reason that they bought this long list of properties in the Bahamas was because they were relocating. They wanted their staff to move there. They wanted to hire new employees and give them a place to live, and not require them to, as a part of this whole process of interviewing and relocating and, all that, also having to find a place to stay. And so part of the argument was also that they were trying to hire really good employees. He said highly compensated people, ex-Google, ex-Facebook types of people. And so having fancy ass Bahamian apartments was part of that. Okay. And then they get into Sam Bankman-Fried's sort of public persona. They ask, did you mean to become the public face of FTX? He says, no, it kind of just happened. He basically agreed to do a couple of interviews, and then those once he did a couple of interviews, other people wanted interviews, and by the time he had so many interviews that he didn't know what to do with them, it was like too late to choose someone else to be another face of FTX. I don't know how much I believe that. He seemed kind of to relish that from what I have observed, but that was the story. He said he was somewhat introverted naturally, which got kind of a laugh out of the overflow room that I was in. They asked him about the shorts and a t-shirt. He said it was because it was comfortable. They asked why he didn't cut his hair, and he said it was because he was busy and lazy. I don't know if that was coached. It seems like a bad idea to say that you're lazy in front of the jury, but that was what he said. And then they brought up, again, they're really jumping around, but they brought up one of the government exhibits, which was the Instagram post by Katy Perry, where he is standing with like a group of 10 or so people, which includes Katy Perry, Orlando Bloom, Michael Kivas, who's the like mastermind celebrity connector guy. I think Kate Hudson is in it, maybe. Anyway, they're all at the Super Bowl posing for a photo, and they bring this up. And this was very weird because it wasn't really clear what point they were trying to make. I think they believed maybe that the prosecution was trying to portray that like he had spent all this money to be there, or it was improper for him to be there, or he was living at large or something. And he basically said he just so happened to be at the Super Bowl because he was in town and he'd never been, and so he thought it might be fun, and they were going to have the commercial, so it just seemed reasonable for him to be there. He said he ended up there. And then he testified that he had met Kivas 2 nights before. And then he said, they asked him how he ended up being in this like nice, like private box that Kivas had rented, or someone associated with him had rented. And he said he had been wandering around the stadium late for another meeting that I couldn't find. And he just ran into Michael Kivas and they invited him in. And it was like, I don't know if I believe that, but like I don't think there's any reasonable way they're going to disprove that. So like, okay, you can say whatever he wants, but like that just seemed to test the boundaries of believability, in my opinion. They did ask about political consultants. Someone in the chat earlier asked about charges against Michael Sadowski, who is one of the Guarding Against Pandemics guys. His name came up, but again, I don't think they were really trying to imply too much there. I did notice that when Guarding Against Pandemics came up, they never mentioned the fact that it was run by Sam Bankman-Fried's brother. I am pretty confident that will come up in cross-examination because it certainly seems very nepotistic, but yeah, they just described Guarding Against Pandemics as like one of the political groups that they worked with and did not mention that slight detail. All right, before I go into the political stuff around his congressional testimony, I'm going to catch up on the chat real quick and find some water at some point. Actually, I'm going to do that in the other order. All right. Someone said that Dak Prescott is the one that does the Sleep Number ad. That was the name. He mentioned that by name, mentioned him by name. I did not know who that was, but you've told me it's the Dallas Cowboys quarterback, and I believe you. Do we know 100% that Friedberg was a whistleblower? Also, will we ever know if Trabuco talked to the DOJ? I'm trying to remember. I think I'm getting it confused. I think it was right after the FTX bankruptcy, one of the lawyers ran to the FBI basically, but I think it was Ryan Miller, not Dan Friedberg. So I don't know if Friedberg was a whistleblower. We do know from yesterday that the government does have interviews that they were able to have to do with him. I don't know the circumstances under which those interviews happened. And they're not like government exhibits or anything. Like they're not something that I can just go and read. So that's all I really know. And as far as Trabucco, he is a big question mark right now. His name has come up, obviously, and in several instances throughout this case, but nobody knows where he is. There were no charges filed against him. It's not clear that he's spoken to the government at any point. For all I know, he's on his boat in like international waters, and he's never been seen. He hasn't tweeted since like the day FTX fell apart. He had at that point left Alameda Research because he was co-CEO with Caroline Ellison, but from various accounts, it sounds like he basically checked out as soon as he became co-CEO and was like ready to retire at that point. I mean, he's what, like 30-ish, maybe a little younger. So I don't know about retire, but I mean, he certainly had enough money to stop working. So he just like stopped showing up to work and stuff like that. So it's unclear like to what extent he was actually involved, but it is very weird that he's just like totally absent from this whole thing. Surprised they didn't get into the housing being a polycule. So I will remind you that this was the defense team questioning Sam Bankman-Fried today. They are not going to bring stuff like that up. It might come up from the prosecution. I don't know if it will. I feel like the polycule stuff is really overblown, honestly. This kind of annoyed me. It was like, I get it. People like the salacious stuff and it's a good headline. And oh my God, I can't believe they were all polyamorous, but there's actually really no evidence that they were polyamorous. This all really came from one of Caroline Ellison's Tumblr posts, I think, where she was talking about that Chinese harem thing. And I think she's talked about polyamory before and even maybe referred to being polyamorous or, being open to it or something. But like, I don't think there's actually any evidence that any of them were ever in a polyamorous relationship. Sam dated Caroline Ellison. He dated the Modulo Capital person whose name I'm forgetting at this point. But like, I think basically everyone else in that apartment seems to have been in like a committed monogamous relationship. Many of those couples are now married. Like, I don't actually think they were polyamorous. I think that was just something that people got really worked up about. Defense will be done at noonish on Monday. Sam is going to have a long weekend knowing Cross is coming. So someone today, I'm not going to take credit for this idea because it was proposed to me by someone else. And I was like, oh yeah, that might be right. I did get the impression today that they were dragging things out and that they were delaying. And I apologize because I cannot remember who, was theorizing that they probably wanted to try to leave the jury on a high note. Like maybe to whatever extent Sam Bankman-Fried is able to charm the jury, leave them with that impression over the weekend instead of having the prosecutor come out guns blazing, tearing him apart, and then they go home thinking about how badly that all went and how guilty Sam Bankman-Fried seems. Like, let them marinate on whatever good impression Sam Bankman-Fried manages to leave. So, and I think that's maybe reasonable. I think that's why today felt really dragged out. I've skipped over a lot of stuff here, but like there was so much time spent defining what a future was, what it means to have a long position or a short position. He had to define what a code base was. What else? There were like a whole bunch of things that were just like, not only was it not super relevant, it was stuff that other witnesses had already defined. So it's like the jury should know what a code base is, for example. I wrote some of these things down and that was kind of it, but like the things that he was supposed to define. Yes, he had to define socialized losses, futures trading, spot margin, risk engine. I think I mentioned long and short positions, code base, database, order book, And of course, in each of these particular cases, Sam Bankman-Fried goes into long explanations of all of these things. Backstop liquidity provider. And like I said, a lot of these things have been defined before. So it really felt like they were stalling. Nothing came up today yet about the beanbags. This damn YouTube chat jumping around is driving me insane. Who schedules a meeting at the Super Bowl? That's what I thought. Like, I assume he just meant he was supposed to meet up with some other people who were there and that they were not having like a business meeting at the Super Bowl, but it was very weird because the way he phrased it, it made it sound like he was having some sort of meeting at the Super Bowl, which, like, what? No, you don't have to think of a clever, interesting question when I catch up on the chat. I'm trying to just scroll through and skip stuff that has come up already. I think a couple of people have talked about the delay tactic. Someone said it was maybe Leo Schwartz. It was not Leo Schwartz because I definitely spoke to him one time today, very briefly it was over lunchtime, I think, and it was not about this. But I think a lot of people sort of had that impression, honestly. The judge has leeway to push them along and prevent stalling, but I think he's trying to be somewhat accommodating just so he seems like he's not just like totally like hamstringing the defense, because I think he's already been I mean, I don't know to what extent he cares about this impression, but I think some people have the impression that the judge has been overly generous to the prosecution. And so, I think he was being more accommodating than usual today around the amount of time that things were taking. Although he did, for sure, when there were objections to meandering responses, he always sustained them. Lewis insinuated on the podcast that the judge was warming up to SBF. I did not get that impression. No, I disagree with Michael Lewis on that. Yes, the yacht is named, it's either named Soak My Deck or Soak My Decks. I've heard it pluralized. Either way, dumb name. It's funny, but it's dumb. Why was there no jury yesterday, but a jury today? They were having a hearing on the admissibility of some of the testimony. I'm trying to avoid answering stuff over and over for people who've been here the whole time. But I discussed that at the beginning if you want to rewind. Okay, I'm going to go back to this now. I lost my place. Okay. Did I jump to a weird place at some point? I may have gotten something out of order. I'm not going to spend too much time worrying about it. I apologize if I did. Yeah, okay, so this was towards the beginning of the testimony. They were talking about Alameda Research. When they went into like a weird amount of detail about the first office for Alameda Research, which was an Airbnb in California. They wanted him to describe the layout of the Airbnb. And I think personally, I took a note here that it really felt like they were trying to make him feel relatable, because he like cracked a joke about it was a 2-bedroom Airbnb, but it had a couch. So that's 3 bedrooms, and it had an attic. That's 4 bedrooms. Like, he was just, it came off really staged. And he gave this little anecdote about how there were all these Amazon boxes everywhere, and eventually they had to deal with the cardboard box program. And it was like, come on, like, that just felt really planned. Um, they asked about the naming of Alameda Research, which for those of you who maybe have followed this already, you would know that at one point before the collapse, Sam Bankman-Fried went on a podcast. I want to say it was with The Block, but don't quote me on that, where they asked about the name. And he said, oh, well, we named it that because otherwise there was no chance we were going to get a bank account. Because if we called it, and he said something like, if we called it Shitcoin Day Traders Incorporated, there was no way anyone was ever going to give us the bank account because banks wanted nothing to do with crypto. So we called it Alameda Research because Alameda was the name of the county that they were in California, and research because who doesn't like research? That was the original story. Different answer today, I noticed. And I'm positive. I mean, there's no way this is not going to come up in cross. They have already played that clip earlier with a different witness. Like, I mean, I feel like they're just asking for this to come up in cross. But he said that they wanted to be under the radar about their crypto association because of competitors. He didn't want competitors to know what they were doing. And I wrote, lol, okay. They asked about this, quote, split or schism at Alameda Research around the time Caroline Ellison joined. And he was asked about what he said to Caroline Ellison about this split. This was the first time that Judge Kaplan sort of slapped him down a little bit. He had gone on this really meandering answer to try to give all this context about what happened with this split. And he was like, no, the question was, what did you say to Caroline Ellison? And so Sam Bankman-Fried acknowledged that and then immediately started giving background context. All right. They went back to talking about why they moved to Hong Kong. He said that they had a 30 square foot WeWork in Hong Kong. I wrote, does Sam Bankman-Fried not know what a square foot is? Because that's not plausible. So I was like, what? That's kind of weird. All right. Then we went into a bunch of socialized losses, definitions and stuff like that of things like socialized losses, futures trading. This was the point at which I got locked out of my courtroom and moved upstairs to 24. They started asking about these like blog posts and various posts that went on the FTX website about spot margin trading, about risk engine. I could not figure out what they were going for at this point. And there were some objections to these documents being brought in. They did accept one of them into evidence, and it was accepted. It was offered not for truth, which basically means like the jury is not supposed to read the document and understand anything written in the document to be like a truthful statement. They're just basically supposed to accept the fact that like this blog post existed, which like I don't know what the point of that really is, but anyway, they asked about the risk engine. This was all very exhausting. There was an objection to one of the documents, which ultimately they ended up calling a sidebar and then decided it was time for the break. And so we all left. And then there was some amount of discussion about this document before the jury came back, where basically they were objecting to it. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it was not that interesting, but the objection was sustained. They were not allowed to enter this document. The jury was brought back. At this point, the woman gave me the seat with the monitor, and I noted that Sam Bankman-Fried's hair was not parted down the middle. And he had 2 water bottles today. More questions about Hong Kong. Again, not interesting or useful. It felt like just delays. So I'm going to keep skipping through stuff because I don't need to drag this out as much as they were. I sat there and suffered through pointless questioning. I'm not going to make you do it. All right, we got into, at this point, questions about the Alameda FTX relationship, which is an actually interesting topic. First, they made him define more things. So we learned what a market maker was and a liquidity provider, which is largely the same thing. He uses the terms interchangeably. What's a line of credit? Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, boring and sleepy. And then we got to the sort of meat of what I think a lot of their defense is. Alameda Research was a backstop liquidity provider and a customer on FTX. Alameda was permitted to borrow. And so this is really where we're trying to, where their testimony is starting to actually, or their story is starting to come out. Basically, Alameda Research was allowed to borrow, like so many customers were, because they were trading on margin. And so, you know, they were allowed to do that. They were allowed to do anything with those assets that they borrowed. He basically said they were allowed to withdraw assets off the exchange. And he suggested that all customers were allowed to do that. Pretty sure that conflicts with a testimony that we received earlier in the week, where I forget if it was, maybe it was Gary Wong who said this, I don't remember, but someone said that it was only Alameda Research who was able to draw down the line of credit and then withdraw those funds from the exchange. He testified that like other market makers had a line of credit, as did Alameda Research, although it was those were much smaller than Alameda's. But those people were not allowed to just like draw down the line of credit and like cash out $1 million and run. They had to use that line of credit on FTX for trading purposes, whereas Alameda Research was not. So that will probably come up on cross. Oh, I know what happened. The reason that I got out of order is I started reading these front to back, which is not how I've been taking notes. I took notes all on one side and then I turned it around and went the other direction. So I apologize for the out of order stuff, but it doesn't really matter. Then they started talking about the risk engine and what it was supposed to do, and that took a long time. But they ultimately said that the rapid growth of FTX caused, quote, growing pains with the risk engine. And so he said that by 2020, this risk engine, which was the thing that was supposed to go through all the positions on the exchange and determine whether or not someone was allowed to maintain that position or if it needed to be liquidated or whatever. He said that by 2020, the risk engine was, quote, sagging under the weight of the growth of FTX and had become backlogged by many minutes. And so he actually spoke about, we actually got something new finally, because a lot of today was spent just like rehashing stuff that other witnesses have said. He talked a little bit about an incident in 2020 when a user with a relatively small position, he said it was somewhere in the thousands of dollars, which is like quite small compared to some of the positions that like trading firms might have had. This user needed to be liquidated. The risk engine was backlogged. And so as this liquidation was being processed, like the risk engine fell behind and started repeatedly trying to close this position because it like tried to close the position and then the risk engine couldn't determine that they had closed this position. And so it tried to do it again and again and again. And then it started to see that it had closed this position too many times. So I guess it started undoing it. And he said it like ping-ponged back and forth. Ultimately, he said that they ended up with these positions that were first in the millions and then the billions and then the trillions of dollars of trades. Now, this is all happening on FTX, the exchange, which is a centralized exchange. So it's not like these are actually being recorded to the blockchain. Trillions of dollars of trades would obviously be a momentous occasion in the crypto world. So this never really made it off FTX, and there wasn't actual money flowing around at this point. And so nothing actually really happened off the exchange, but it did take the exchange offline for an hour while they unwound all of these trades that the risk engine had erroneously made. And he basically spoke about how this was a point that really made him very concerned about the possibility of auto liquidations and these sort of deleveraging events causing, he said, quote, systemic risk. And so they responded to it first by bumping up the resources for the risk engine, obviously, so that it wasn't lagging. But then he basically said that this was why they had put in place some this is what that were referred to as speed bumps yesterday around the liquidation of Alameda, where instead of just being liquidated automatically like any other customer might be, there were delays, or yesterday he said he wasn't sure if it was like a delay or like an extra confirmation step or something like that. Today he also says that basically he talked to Gary Wang and Nishad Singh about the liquidation of Alameda Research, and that they needed a system to either catch or stop what he is careful to refer to as erroneous liquidations of Alameda Research, because he doesn't want to claim that Alameda Research couldn't get liquidated if their positions went underwater. So he's like, it was only the erroneous ones. He was like, maybe an alert, put in a delay, something. And he basically claims that Gary Wang and Nishad Singh were like, yeah, we'll fix it. And then they just went and did this whole allow negative thing themselves, and he never knew about it. So that was one of the first times today where they directly began to contradict some of the previous testimony. And they did do that a couple of times where like he is recounting the same conversations that we heard about from either Gary Wang or Nishad Singh. But he's giving a somewhat different version of events where it's like in all of these conversations, they covered the same topics, but his story is slightly different in that he had no idea what was going on. So that was the first instance of that today. All right, I'm going to keep going. Another bunch of stuff. Okay, so they eventually now get to this tweet that was brought into evidence by the government earlier on in the prosecutor's case. So this is a government exhibit, and it was a tweet by a person named Bitshine. I don't remember which newsletter of mine this was because I can't remember exactly which testimony it was, but I did include a screenshot of this tweet in one of my newsletters. And it's where this guy who's just like an anonymous crypto Twitter guy asks, like, how can we trust that FTX is not giving Alameda Research special privileges? Like, isn't there such a clear conflict of interest here? And Sam Bankman-Fried responds on Twitter to this person to say that Alameda Research's account on FTX is just like everyone else's. And so the defense bring this up because they know that this is going to be used to sort of impugn Sam Bankman-Fried's, they're going to say, clearly you were lying at that point because you knew that there was like this delay or this this alert or confirmation step that was added for liquidations. And doesn't that mean you were lying to this guy on Twitter? And so they brought it up themselves because that allowed Sam Bankman-Fried to say that he thought at that point in that tweet that Bitshine was asking specifically about front running. And he never intended or thought that Alameda Research would front run trades. How he came to believe that this guy was speaking specifically about front running is not clear to me because the tweet does not mention front running. So this seemed really tenuous to me, but like that's what they're trying to do, and they were trying to address it. All right, moving along. Yeah, so they start talking about the bank accounts and the fact that FTX couldn't get bank accounts. And he does some of the weird wording that he did yesterday, where he was saying during the hearing yesterday, like, it was taking a long time for FTX to get bank accounts, as though like somehow the process just happened to take years for no reason. And he did a lot of that today, where he was like not saying that they were being denied bank accounts or that they were like having to repeatedly apply for these because their bank accounts or because the banks didn't want to service them. He was like, it was just taking a long time. He was like, in 2019, 2020, FTX, quote, had not yet been able to get bank accounts in its own name. And it's like, wonder why that was, which again, I think is going to come up in cross. Boop, boop, boop. Just skipping through a bunch of repetitive stuff. This is where my handwriting is really degrading. Oh, so now they bring up one of the the prosecution's exhibits, and it's just a picture of him sitting at his desk, and he's got there's like only a couple of his screens in the picture, but it's very clear that he's got like 6 or so monitors in front of him. And at this point, they start trying. It's very clear that they're trying to rebut testimony by at least Caroline Ellison. I want to say Nishad maybe testified to this too, where they basically said he always had on one of his screens a chart or a spreadsheet or something that showed Alameda Research's balances on it. They were trying to say that he knew Alameda Research financial condition quite clearly because he had this thing open on his monitors all the time and he would look at it like every day. He said that, oh yeah, sure, maybe I had this page open that had Alameda Research stuff on it, but he was just watching some of the trades that they were doing. And maybe in the background somewhere, there were like old spreadsheets that he never closed, or like old tabs that he had basically never closed from when he was CEO of Alameda Research. And I was like, really, man, that's all you got? Like, why even bring that up if that's all you've got? They talked a little bit about the terms of service. So they were allowed to talk about the terms of service. They were just limited to talk to the amount that he was allowed to talk about, like the extent to which he consulted with lawyers on it. I noticed some of his answers were different from yesterday, not in like they weren't like factually different. You know, it wasn't like he was contradicting stuff that he said yesterday, but it was clearly streamlined, and like he clearly was coached a little bit on how to answer those questions better. And so I actually took a note at this point. Was it actually good for Sam Bankman-Fried that questions yesterday went beyond the scope of the hearing? Because the defense yesterday was objecting to the fact that the prosecution seemed to sort of go down this tangential road, and which they did to some extent, where Sam Bankman-Fried was starting to like I'd like sort of get backed into a corner on some stuff. And the defense was like, this is outside of the scope of the hearing. Like, we don't want to be talking about this. And I'm wondering today if to some extent that may have actually been good, because like all this stuff about the terms of service and, you know, some of the things around the portions of the terms of service that talked about margin trading and futures trading, like he got a chance to answer those questions and then answer them again today after having talked to his defense team. So like to some extent it gave him a practice run. They talked about the FTT token price and its creation. None of that was terribly illuminating. They did talk a little bit, though, about the allegations that were made that Alameda Research was basically propping up the FTT token price. And so that came up earlier. I want to say it was during Caroline Ellison's testimony. He was saying that he believed that they should start buying FTT when the token went down a certain amount, because that's just a good trade. You buy low and you sell high. And it's not market manipulation if you're buying low and selling high, because that can be a profitable trade. It's only market manipulation if you're making a trade that is not advantageous to you, and, you know, in order to move the market. And so clearly he wasn't doing that. At this point, Judge Kaplan jumps in to instruct the jury that Sam Bankman-Fried is not a lawyer, and that his opinion on what is or is not market manipulation should be taken to be his opinion, rather than any sort of legal interpretation. And that if at any point he feels that the jury needs to know the legal definition of market manipulation, they should listen to him on that, and that his opinion on what is market manipulation is the, you know, source of truth. Which is like, ooh, you know, he got kind of slapped down a little bit on that. They asked if FTX had a risk management department, and this is, again, one of those points where he took the opportunity to be sort of like contrite And he's like, we sure should have had one, but we didn't. And I was like, okay, yeah, you definitely should have, my man. They then started asking him about how many hours he worked. So I don't know if they're going to try to claim that, like, oh, he was just so sleep deprived, he couldn't possibly keep up with everything that was going on. He claims that he worked 12 hours on a light day, 22 on a heavy day, and that he took off a Monday every couple of months. I don't believe him. When was he playing League of Legends? Or Storybook Brawl if he was working? I just don't believe you on this. He also claimed that he was receiving thousands of emails a day. He made some very cute, relatable remark about how, like, some people shoot for inbox 0. I shot for inbox 60,000, but I usually failed. Like, we get it. You were important. And he also said that he was in a couple hundred Signal channels. So again, I think this is all part of an argument that may come out from the defense. That's like, he was just stretched too thin and he missed, it was all a big oopsie and he missed the deficit here. Oh, here's a good one. So at some point he starts to talk about his involvement with Alameda Research. So he was the CEO of Alameda Research. I mean, he founded Alameda Research and he was the CEO. He then founded FTX and was the CEO. He basically, it was saying that FTX's growth meant that it was taking more and more of his time. And so he was paying less and less attention to Alameda Research. And he said that by 2021, it was becoming untenable for him to remain CEO as both of them. And so he was sort of stepping away from day-to-day involvement and then finally formally resigned in mid-2021. And he said something that he said yesterday too, which was that he still was involved in Alameda Research as far as ventures were involved and as far as hedging was involved, which is a very convenient thing for him to say, because he's basically saying all of the parts where Alameda did bad things and lost money, I was not involved. But as far as like risk management and, making sure that they were being responsible, I was very involved, and Caroline Ellison just wouldn't listen to me. So that was kind of the story that was coming out there. He was also asked to give his opinion on Caroline Ellison and Sam Trabucco, who are the co-CEOs that he named to replace him. I mentioned this earlier, but Sam Trabucco later left. So then it was just Caroline Ellison. I think his defense team quite correctly realized that it would not come off well if he just slammed Caroline Ellison at this point. And so he was clearly trying to be very complimentary, that he felt like they were capable. They were both good traders. They complemented each other, which was a very carefully inserted line that was absolutely rehearsed. He was asked to describe Caroline Ellison's, how she worked, how she did as a CEO. He said she was a good manager. She was smart. She was heavily involved with day-to-day stuff. She was good at interfacing with the developer team. She was good at research and writing mathematical models. And then at this point, he sort of introduces the criticism, which was that she had not focused as much on risk management or unusual trading opportunities or risks. And so at this point, he's saying, but that's why I had Sam Trabucco as the co-CEO, because he was great at risk management and at evaluating unusual trading opportunities or risks. And so the narrative here is that when Sam Trabucco resigned, the risk management went away, and Caroline Ellison was not doing that well. They asked if he discussed adding a new co-CEO. He said that he had brought up potentially adding in Ben Shia as co-CEO. Ben Shia was, I mispronounced his name yesterday. I think I said it was Ben Shia. It's Ben Shia, Xie. They discussed adding him as a co-CEO. He continued to be the head of trading at Alameda and was by all accounts a good trader. Bankman-Fried claims that Caroline Ellison rejected that idea, and he said, and that was that, as though he had no say in who was the CEO of the company that he owned. And so he said that he remained ultimately significantly involved in risk management. because he felt like Caroline Ellison needed help and support, and he was concerned about what would happen if he was not involved. So that's that story. That's where we're really seeing that come out. All right, we're getting to the end of this, because this is when we had our lunch break, which was at I don't know, 12:30, 12:45. And it was actually a really nice lunch break. I didn't actually eat lunch, but I did get a coffee, which was what I really needed. And I met Burb. If you guys know Bone Condor on Twitter, I think her handle is like Chairman Burb Bernanke right now. Did I pronounce that wrong? Anyway, she's super funny and just a lovely person in real life. And I also met a Slate journalist who I'd spoken to once before, and it was just a really lovely lunch break. And we got to all bitch about how bored we were and how we were worried. At this point, I was like, I don't think cross-examination is going to happen today, and I am flying home tonight, and I don't want to miss cross-examination. At this point, I was like resigned to flying home and just hoping that desperately that they would just like wrap it up and move on to cross. I'm aware that Burb said that I ran away from her and that she was worried that she smelled bad. She actually smelled lovely. I noticed when she sat down that she had like a nice perfume on, so she smelled great. I was so hungry at that point because I had not eaten, and so I needed a Cliff Bar, and so I went and left coincidentally around the same time she sat down. Not causative, just correlated. Okay. Oh, now I'm getting to the part that I accidentally read earlier. So this was the real part where they're talking about, what was it? Hong Kong, some of the marketing spending, some of the loans, all that kind of stuff. And him becoming the public face of FTX. Apparently, according to him, not by his own choice. So, yeah. Congress. Okay, so this is when they start talking about his conversations with Congress. He said he was engaging with Congress to talk about pandemic prevention and other, quote, non-business topics, because he's just such a good guy who wants to save the world. And also he was talking to them about crypto regulation. Which he wanted to help establish a regulatory framework for crypto because he wanted FTX to be able to operate in the US. And I mean, they had the FTX US entity at this point, but it was really small. Even at the time of the collapse, when FTX US was as mature as it ever was going to get, it remained very small. Like nobody used it. But they had basically formed this entity, and then he, I think, was very much hoping that he could influence regulations, and then FTX US could become a big and, competitive part of the US crypto market. Obviously, that did not happen. Some stuff about FTX's government affairs department, which I think the point of this questioning, although it's not super clear to me, was that they're trying to claim that those guys helped him with a written testimony to Congress so that they can maybe claim that, anything in that was bad was not his fault. I don't know. He was testifying to the fact that he gave 3 in-person testimonies to various subsets of Congress. This is not counting the planned testimony that never ended up happening that would have happened shortly after the FTX collapse if he had not been arrested. The hearing happened either way, but he did not show up to testify because he was in jail at that point. But they started to talk about his 3rd testimony, which was to the House Agriculture Committee. If anyone is curious why the people in crypto talk to the ag committees a lot, it's because the ag committees have oversight over the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which is the regulator for basically Bitcoin futures and crypto futures. So anyway, he was talking about how he was testifying to the ag committee, and he started to talk about how part of the reason he thought it was important to testify during this particular hearing was for one, it was specifically about whether or not to approve some application that FTX US had made around, they wanted to do something more around futures trading. So like that alone, he could have just stopped the question there if he was trying to just answer why he was at this testimony or giving this testimony, because like that is a very adequate answer. Oh, but no, he wanted to sneak in that he also believed that competitors were pushing back on FTX's application to the CFTC, which is a fun little conspiracy. And there were some objections to this, and they tried to get him to be allowed to answer this. He said he believed that competitors were pushing back because of what he was hearing from FTX employees and also what he was hearing from congressional staff, which is like, I'd love to know more about that. But ultimately, one of the objections from the prosecution was sustained, and they had to just sort of drop that line of questioning. Okay, so at this point they start talking about eco serum, and I was like, oh god, this is going to get really into the weeds, because they just like have to explain what staking means to the poor jury who are already glazing over at this point because they've had to hear him define everything else. The point of this, I'm not going to go into all the details because like it's just exhausting and you don't need to suffer through it. But the reason that they started talking about this is because Nishad Singh had testified that there was this whole thing about how Sam Bankman-Fried wanted to hit $1 billion in revenue, and they were coming in just underneath that. And so Nishad Singh testified that Sam Bankman-Fried told him to backdate all of these internal transactions so that they were basically charging fees on serum staking that they had not been charging. And that would be enough to push the revenue up above $1 billion, which just seems like it was a vanity thing for Sam Bankman-Fried. Like he wanted to be able to claim that they had hit $1 billion of revenue. And sure enough, there were all these interviews and statements to media around that time where he was crowing about this $1 billion number. He did testify today that he had had a conversation with Ramnik Arora about whether or not revenue would be above or below $1 billion, because he did want to get revenue to above $1 billion. And so his defense team asked him, why did you want that? He said, because it's just a round number. I am sure if the number had been above $1 billion, if it was like $1.1 billion, he sure would have rounded down so that it was nice and round. Anyway, so he had asked Ramnik Arora about this, and then he testified that Ramnik Arora later told him that Nishad Singh had updates to give him. And so he went and asked Nishad Singh about it, and Nishad Singh, according to Sam Bankman-Fried, just told him that he had dealt with it. And he asked Nishad what that meant, and Nishad Singh said there were $50 million in EcoSerum staking rewards. Isn't that convenient? That's just what they needed to get above this $1 billion number. Sam Bankman-Fried claims that he was surprised because he didn't even know that there were EcoSerum rewards. What a lovely coincidence. He also was asked, did backdating come up? And he said, no, he didn't recall that it did. So at this point, I drew this little picture, which was Sam Bankman-Fried throwing Nishad Singh under the bus. At this point, they start talking about the insurance fund amount, which is leading up to questions around the incidents with MobileCoin. So to draw back a little bit on previous testimony, there was an incident where a trader was able to take out a position in MobileCoin, which is a type of cryptocurrency that was not very liquid, took out a huge position in it, allegedly manipulated the market somehow, and was able to change the price of, actually there were, today he testified that there were two cryptos involved. It was MobileCoin and also BTMX. It may have been BTMX that he manipulated the market on, or maybe it was both. Anyway, he was able to get this huge position and then exploit some sort of bug, I guess, in the FTX code where he was able to withdraw a whole bunch of money and leave FTX in a deficit. And so there was testimony earlier in the trial from Nishad Singh, I think. I can't fully remember. I think it was Nishad Singh, who said that Sam Bankman-Fried had decided that Alameda Research should take on that debt so that, A, it wouldn't show up to, because basically FTX's balance sheets were more available than Alameda Research's because they had, lenders and things like that who were able to view them for various reasons. And so he basically testified that he had just moved that debt to Alameda Research so people wouldn't notice it. And then also that, I'm blanking on it now. I was about to say something. I forgot what the other thing was. Oh, and so that he could claim that the insurance fund on FTX had never been drawn down, had never been depleted, basically. And he had testified to Congress that there had never been these big losses, nothing above, I think the number was really low. It was like $4 million or something like that, and to be clear, this loss was like 100 million plus or something like that. So they were trying to get out in front of that. And it was a very sort of meandering response, but basically he claims that Gary Wong, Nishad Singh, and Ryan Salem raised concerns to him that this trader was manipulating prices. He claims that he basically said, I'll take responsibility for this, I'll monitor it, see what's going on with this account. And then he claims that he basically didn't do so adequately and it was all his fault. He should have paid more attention to it. He should have realized that this trader had taken on such a big position and it was risky. But he claimed that the insurance fund was not involved, that it was never had to draw on this insurance fund, which is convenient given that would mean he didn't lie. But because he felt so guilty for failing to monitor the status of this account, he decided that he felt like Alameda Research should take on this position because he owned Alameda Research. And so effectively it was like he was paying for this. He felt, in his testimony, he felt like he was sort of absorbing this debt. And it was just because he was feeling guilty, which, like, again, this was one of those things that was like, oh my God, that was the best you could come up with for this particular incident. Like, I don't know if that's believable. I mean, I obviously come into this with some skepticism around Sam Bankman-Fried from my prior beliefs, but like, boy, that seems to be stretching credibility. Okay, this is just a cute, funny moment. Cute, not that Sam Bankman-Fried was being cute. It was just like funny. But so they start to talk about Slack and Signal. And if you listen to my little discussion of this yesterday, they start out asking Sam to talk about encryption. And I mentioned yesterday that he went into this long explanation about how, like, well, technically, most internet traffic is encrypted these days because everything uses HTTPS. And like, he's just going on and on and on. And then, oh, but Signal is encrypted in a different way because it's end-to-end encrypted and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking yesterday, like, thank God the jury is not here because he's going to lose all of them. Like, none of them are technical. There's like one finance guy, but everyone else that's like, they're not coders. They're not tech people. I was like, oh my God, this is not going well. Clearly he had gotten some coaching overnight on that particular point, but it was not enough to keep him fully in line. So he didn't go into nearly as much of an explanation about how, well, technically most internet traffic is encrypted, but he did. They asked him to define encryption. And so he says, something fairly reasonable about how it's, the way that people can't read all of your messages on Slack. They're not public, it's encrypted. And then he says that encryption became prominent in World War II, where it was used for codes and, code breakers were studying cryptography. And there was like a burst of laughter in this overflow room because it was like, dude, just try to restrain yourself. And then they went in a little bit to how why they use Signal, and he used the same explanation from yesterday, which was that um, he was using it because he was worried that FTX could get hacked. Which, sure. This was the point at which they started to talk about the document retention policy, and they had clearly tightened this up from yesterday too, where yesterday he was very vague about like the extent to which he had really read this policy. Today they said Cohen, his defense lawyer who was questioning him, said basically this was one of the few times that he told Sam Bankman-Fried, like, please just keep it to a yes or no answer. Did you review the document retention policy? And Sam Bankman-Fried said yes. And so like that sort of stopped him from introducing doubt himself into the extent at which he had read this. Oh, let me just quickly look something up. I just want to make sure I'm not saying something wrong. I knew it. Okay. Just making sure. So they asked him about outside investments in the company. And he was asked to enumerate them. So he said there was the seed round, and then they did a $1 billion Series B in mid-2021. There was another he called it a follow-on round a couple months later, which he said was for investors who needed a little bit more time before they would commit. And then they did a third funding round in late 2022, which was a Series C. And he did not offer the amounts for the second two funding rounds until he was prompted by his defense attorney. When his defense attorney asked him how much he raised in the second, the Series B1 round, like the follow-on round, he said it was around $500 million. What he did not say was that it was 420,690,000, which was the actual number of this Series B round, which included 69 investors. It was like all this sort of dumb joke, which he did not mention, because I don't know how old or young the jury is and to what extent they would pick up on like the 420-69 joke, but like I don't think they wanted to take the chance. So I wonder if that'll come up on cross, or if the prosecutors are just going to be like, it's not worth it. Like there's no wrongdoing there. It just makes them seem dumb. This is when we come back from afternoon break. So we're almost done here. Thank you for bearing with me. I was expecting this to be so much shorter than yesterday, and it has not been, and that is my fault. Excuse me. At this point, Judge Kaplan started to pull him back a little bit on his testimony being very meandering. He would ask a question, and then they would ask a question, he would answer the question, and then just continue on to like very long explanations of other things or related things. And Judge Kaplan was like, just answer the question. They start talking about the general crypto crash at this point and the fact that Bitcoin prices were going down. So this is a part of one of the arguments that they've tried to make in the past, which is that, oh, oopsie daisy, Alameda Research only lost money because they were long crypto. And so the crypto markets went down, and therefore Alameda Research went down. And, it's just, oh no, we're just another one of those companies that got wiped out by external, factors that were outside of our control. I don't think it's believable, but like they got to give it a shot, right? So he's starting to talk at this point about how they were leveraged long, which of course they have to stop and get him to explain what that means. It's like, you can put that in a clearer way, my dude. It's just a fancy way of saying that you were betting that crypto prices would go up forever. And this was when they started to talk more about hedging. And so he's saying that he discussed hedging with Caroline Ellison in late 2021. He went into way more detail. The question was basically, what did you say to Caroline Ellison about hedging? And he went into just all this detail that was far beyond whatever he said to Caroline Ellison. And so they had to strike the whole answer And, Kaplan had just gotten finished saying, please stop giving these really long responses. And sure enough, he's right back at it. He believed that she was unenthusiastic about hedging. He said that he had a conversation with her every month or two about it. She kept promising him that she hadn't put hedges in place, but she sure was going to. He said by June 2022, Alameda Research still had not put hedges in place. So this is like 6 months, maybe. He said he started talking to her about it in late 2021. She still hadn't hedged by June 2022. At this point, I'm wondering, like, to what extent are you responsible for making her put hedges in place, right? Like, you own this company. She reports to you. You have ultimate control over what happens at Alameda Research. You could fire her. You could hire a new CEO. You could do literally anything because it's your company. And he's just like, oh, well, she won't do it. Maybe next month. Like, I feel like saying that he repeatedly instructed her to hedge and she just wouldn't do it is like, okay, but at some point you are ultimately responsible for that, right? Like, I don't know. More stuff about hedging that was really not clear where they were trying to go with it. At one point he refers to, so this is when they start talking about the bug, the big old bug that overstated Alameda Research's liabilities to FTX by approximately $8 billion. He starts out by saying that he was in the FTX hut. At this point, so they've mentioned the word hut has come up a couple times throughout, and I kept thinking they were referring to these little, like, there was this one picture of, it's like the paddle tennis court or something like that, and it's got this little, it's just like a roof, it's like one of those little tents with there's no walls, but it's just a little roof. That's what I always assumed they were referring to when they were talking about huts. It turns out it was the office. They called the office a hut. It was not a hut. It was like a building, like just a normal building. Why do you have to call it a hut? So they had to have this whole side, like, tangent about just to establish what the fuck he meant by hut. But anyway, he was in the office with Gary Wang and Nishad Singh. Caroline Ellison came up to him and appeared concerned. Adam Yedidia was there at some later on point, but maybe not originally. And he said that Caroline Ellison walked up to them and said she was worried that, quote, Alameda Research had just gone bankrupt. And he said, I was very surprised and fairly concerned. Like, you would think, yeah. She seemed nervous. He asked if she felt confident that Alameda Research had just gone bankrupt. She said, not really. Like, okay. So he said, and he said that she had come up to them and was like, how do we explain this to lenders, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, well, first we should make sure that we're actually bankrupt. And it's like, yeah, that makes sense. And so he apparently talked to Gary Wang and Nishad Singh. They dug into Alameda Research's balances. At this point, they take a little detour to mention that he was supposed to talk to Congress, to senators and staff about some proposed legislation, but because he's a responsible guy, he postponed his trip. I was like, that's just, come on. Anyway, so the coders investigated what was going on, and after a couple hours, they discovered this bug that was overstating Alameda Research's balances by approximately $8 billion. At no point does he mention that throughout this whole thing, so the bug was that it was overstating the balance by $8 billion. It was not saying that the debt was $8 billion. It was actually saying that the debt was $16 billion, and it was overstating that amount by $8 billion. So when they realized there was a bug, the $8 billion of debt was there. It wasn't 16, but it was still 8. And he sort of glossed over that whole point. It was like, he basically was like, they found the bug and then everything was fine. Like, great. I was like, okay. Again, there's been extensive testimony around the fact that there was still $8 billion of debt that Alameda owed to FTX that was customer funds. And so I don't think it's reasonable that the jury is just not going to notice that. But I think that was the hope. And again, even if the jury didn't notice it, there's no way it's not going to come up in cross. So everyone seemed relieved and life went on. And Sam Bankman-Fried is such a responsible guy. He told them to fix the bug and also please write this document, this memo about the bug fix where, and I think actually Adam Yedidia maybe testified to preparing this, where it was like, he fixed the bug and then wrote sort of a post-mortem document about all he did. And they wanted to put it into evidence. And the prosecution objected to it for several reasons. The defense tried to get it into evidence by saying they were offering it not for truth, just for the fact that it existed. I think at this point, the judge maybe sustained the objection, and Cohen asked, may we come to a sidebar? And Kaplan just went, no. He was fed up at this point. There was also a point throughout this where Sam Bankman-Fried kept referring to sending back loans to lenders, and Judge Kaplan basically was like, do you mean pay them? Like, it's weird to say send back a loan to a lender. And so he asked him to clarify this. And at this point, Sam Bankman-Fried was like smiling at the judge a little bit, and seeming very amiable and saying like, oh yes, that's what I meant. Haha. So anyway. This is, I think, just about the end. Yeah. So at this point, we then move on to the question of this fiat at liability that Alameda Research owed to FTX. And so Sam Bankman-Fried has repeatedly, before this case, referred to he didn't know there was this poorly labeled fiat at account. That was like the catchphrase for a long time. And he just didn't realize that there was this $8 billion hole. Now, of course, he did just testify to this bug, during which he should have realized that there was $8 billion still left in this correct field. But again, we'll see if I'm sure they will come back to that. So he starts talking about this. He says he begins to learn about it in conversations in June 2022. Let me just see if there's a date on this whole bug thing. Oh no, this was actually, so maybe he does sort of in a roundabout way acknowledge that he learned about it around this time, because the whole thing where Caroline Ellison comes up to them and says, I think we're bankrupt, was also in June 2022. That was not very clear. I had to just refer to my notes to notice that, but he did sort of acknowledge that he said he learned about it in pieces, and he began learning about it in conversations with Gary Wang and Nishad Singh, and also from conversations he overheard between them. So I think he was trying to say that they were aware and they weren't telling me, but I overheard them, as though they were just secretly stealing money for his benefit or something. He said by October, he was having explicit conversations with them about this fiat at liability. But he says he actually learned about it from a database, not because they told him. So again, he's sort of trying to, I think, imply that they were not forthcoming about this huge deficit. He said he was very surprised to learn about it. They tried to go into this side detail about how it wasn't the production database that he was querying at this point. It was a similar database, because they were worried that if he was running queries on the production database, something bad would happen. They didn't actually go into detail on that because the prosecution objected for some reason, and it was sustained. I don't know why they were trying to mention that he was up until October querying production databases, because you should not be doing that. But I also don't think that the jury is going to care. No one in the jury is going to know that it's not a good idea to be running queries against production that could potentially bring down the production database. But even why risk it? Why bring that up yourself? I don't understand what they were doing there. So yeah, he was very surprised. Again, understatement about this $8 billion hole. Um, he believed that this info at account had fully reflected the liability that Alameda Research owed to FTX. And at that time, that account showed that they had $2 billion in debt to FTX, but far more in assets. And so they're positive net asset value, no big problem. They were using their line of credit to the tune of $2 billion, but they were well above that amount in their assets. But then he learned about this fiat ad account, which had another $8 billion in it, meaning that their total liability was $10 billion. And so that changed things, obviously. But he did testify that he believed it could be paid back. Like, it's not stealing if you pay it back, I guess. And then he said that, he believed that if you started to count his assets, like technically those Robinhood shares were in an entity that was under his name, not under Alameda's name, but he was more than happy to pledge his assets to cover Alameda Research liabilities. Like, again, painting him as this sort of savior figure where it's like, sure, Caroline Ellison lost all this, but I was totally willing to, fill the hole with my own savings so that Alameda Research could continue to survive. Not mentioning, of course, that those Robinhood shares that supposedly belonged to him were purchased with Alameda Research money. Like, it was via a loan. So anyway, like, come on. So here's an interesting detail. They start talking about lenders at this point and the fact that lenders were starting to call back loans in the summer of 2022. And this was, again, around the time Three Arrows Capital had just collapsed. Bitcoin had gone down. A lot of these lenders themselves were starting to go under. Like, they're listing lenders. It was Genesis, BlockFi, Celsius, Voyager. All four of those, I believe, are bankrupt. So, like, this was a tough summer for the lenders. They asked him who he was speaking to at these companies. Not sure why they asked that or what the purpose of this was for his defense, but he did say that he spoke directly to Barry Silbert, which I thought was really interesting. He didn't actually say Barry Silbert's name, but he said he was talking to the CEO of Genesis's parent company, which is Barry Silbert, the CEO of Digital Currency Group, aka DCG, which is the parent company of Genesis. I thought that was really interesting. As a side note, Barry Silbert and DCG and Genesis were just named in a lawsuit from the New York Attorney General's office that alleges that they were involved in a massive fraud. So that's like a cool little fun tidbit. And now they go through all of these calls that he was having with Genesis, BlockFi, Celsius, and Voyager to say, and they go through them one by one to say that each of them was asking Sam Bankman-Fried or FTX or Alameda Research or some combination of the three for money. And they were basically trying to, I think, try to play to that whole sort of like savior of the crypto world narrative that was going on in that summer. That was a much more compelling narrative when Sam Bankman-Fried was not dipping into customer funds to save these other companies, but like, I guess they got to try it. Now they start to talk about this document that has the 7 alternative balance sheets. So for those of you who have sort of kept up with some of the previous coverage of this trial, one of the things Caroline Ellison testified to was that she was basically asked to prepare a balance sheet for Alameda. She did so. She realized that she could not just say, oh, and here's this line item for all this money that we're borrowing from FTX. And oh, here's this line item for all these loans that we've made to our own executives, because obviously no one's going to lend the money if they are admitting to this stuff. And so she prepared, at Sam Bankman-Fried's direction, according to her testimony, 7 alternative balance sheets, which is not something you're supposed to be doing, right? Like, there is some amount of leeway allowed in accounting where, like, sure, you can categorize something as one thing or another. And, there's a little bit of interpretation there. 7 balance sheets that like do different accounting is not generally accepted accounting principles. And I'm not an accountant, but I can confidently say that that's not a generally accepted accounting principle. So anyway, they start talking about that Excel spreadsheet. He says that he discussed it briefly with her. He doesn't recall discussing each tab on this balance sheet, but he definitely discussed alternative number 7. He asked her if Paperbird was included at some point and said that she should consider including it because he's so generous that he was willing to make those Paperbird assets available to Alameda Research. So this particular detail was mentioned because Caroline Ellison had testified that when she was making these balance sheets, he had instructed her to include Paperbird assets in order to make Alameda Research, to fraudulently make them seem like they were like solvent. And so he was trying to say like he was just mentioning it, you know. All right, we're almost done here. Now they start. So this was like just like kind of right in a row. They're just going through all of these conversations that previous witnesses had testified to around all of these ways in which Sam Bankman-Fried directed them to commit fraud. And he's going through and giving his version of events, which is conspicuously different from their version of events, where like, oh, they weren't telling me everything. They were doing the fraud, and I was just having my side of the conversation where I thought everything was fine. So now they go into the conversation he had with Adam Yedidia, who is one of the first witnesses. For those who maybe don't remember him, he was a developer at Alameda, or at both Alameda and then FTX, or maybe the opposite way around. He was not charged with anything. He testified with an immunity grant. He said in case he had inadvertently committed any crimes, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem like he was deeply involved. And it seems like he learned about the fraud. He had like inklings that something maybe was wrong or that things were in a precarious position. But when he learned about the fact that like, oh yeah, Alameda was spending FTX customer money, he like resigned the next day. So as far as I can tell, Adam Yedidia is maybe not one of the masterminds here. But he had testified at this conversation where he said Adam Yedidia had approached him with concerns that Alameda Research was quote unquote not bulletproof. He was worried about this $8 billion hole. SBF said he didn't think it was a big problem, but that he acknowledged that Alameda Research was not bulletproof and that it might be another couple of years before Alameda Research was bulletproof, which I think Adam Yedidia interpreted to mean that Sam Bankman-Fried thought he could make all the money back and would be able to do so, which is kind of damning. Like, you're not supposed to just be like, oh, it's okay, we'll make it back. We'll make it back. Just one more trade, we'll make it back. And so, sorry, I just like choked on my spit. So I sound a little weird. Sam Bankman-Fried basically gave his version of events, and he's like, oh, no, by bulletproof, I meant that I was worried that, there wasn't this hedging happening. There was all this risk with Alameda that he was worried about that wasn't getting addressed, but that's why he thought it wasn't bulletproof. It wasn't because of all that fraud that was happening. Here's another conversation. So then they go into a conversation in August, which was with Nishad Singh, about the interest that was being charged on the Alameda Research account on FTX. This is the Korean friend account that has been brought up several times. So basically, according to Sam, this is Sam's version of events, he noticed that there was interest being charged on the Alameda account on FTX, and he flagged that to Nishad because he said that probably shouldn't be happening. He was being so, proactive in making sure that everything was functioning well. He flagged this to Nishad. According to Sam, Nishad said, oh yeah, I know what's going on. I will deal with that, quote unquote. This was in August. Later on in October, so that would be the month before everything fell apart, Sam testified that Nishad eventually told him that the Fiat account had at one point been moved to become a sub account of the info ad account, which is the main trading account that was like visible. And that was the point at which this interest was inappropriately being charged. And then he said, but then it was moved to a different account. And that was in order to fix this whole interest problem. And this was where they were referring, he basically said that Nishad was referring to the fact that it had been moved to the Korean account, which was this Cyan Charles account, which again, that name is not clear. Apparently there's a Protos article about who that person might be. I haven't had a chance to read it. Anyway, so basically, again, his story is Nishad Singh did it. I basically asked him what was going on. He said, oh, I'll deal with it. And then he just did something and never told me what it was. And oops, he did the fraud. If I can just go back, see if I can find. I believe this is relevant once again. Okay. Almost done here. They went back again over another conversation that happened in August about hedging. He said that Caroline Ellison had not hedged despite many conversations about it. At this point, he said if they had hedged the previous year, Alameda Research would have all this money. And the prosecution, of course, he said if they had had sufficient hedges the previous year, Alameda Research would be solvent at this point. And the prosecution was like, objection, like you can't just say that, they would be solvent if only this thing had happened. Like you can't just make that statement. And the judge was like sympathetic, but basically said like, that's a question for cross-examination. They bring up Caroline Ellison's notes. These were the notes with the things Sam is freaking out about list. And I think this was one of those points where like they're trying to make Sam seem relatable. They go, were you freaking out? And he goes, I don't tend to show a lot of freak outness, but relative to my standard, yes. Like trying to just be like, were you freaking out? Like, oh, it's funny. But basically trying to say that like, yeah, he was worried that Alameda Research wasn't hedging. They go to the document now about when he was considering shutting down Alameda Research. And this was the document that said that basically Caroline Ellison has lost all this money. She's not a good manager. I'm worried that, maybe Alameda Research should just be shut down and I'll replace it with this other hedge or trading firm that, just so happens to be run by another ex-girlfriend of mine, Modulo Capital. They did not bring up the Modulo Capital stuff in the defense portion of the questioning, but they did bring up the idea that he had thought about shutting down Alameda Research because he was worried about the lack of hedging, the lack of risk management, what he described as decaying culture, potentially not the right management at that company. And so he said that, and so during earlier testimony, both Gary Wong and Nishad Singh had testified to the fact that like they went and discussed this whole thing between themselves and also with Caroline Ellison. And they were like, Alameda Research is so far in debt that there's no way we can shut it down because they can't repay this debt. And so you can't just shut it down and, the debt doesn't just vanish. And so that we can't shut it down, basically. Sam Bankman-Fried testified that Gary Wong and Nishad Singh just went off and discussed it between themselves, discussed it with Caroline Ellison, came back and said, no, we shouldn't shut it down. That's a bad idea. But didn't really say why. It's like, really? Like that, really? Now he addresses the conversation that Nishad, and this is like the last thing that they really got to, I think, today. Yeah, this is the very last question that they had, or discussion that they had, which was the conversation that Sam Bankman-Fried had with Nishad Singh on the balcony. And this was a very dramatic moment during Nishad Singh's testimony where he was basically confronting Sam over the missing money. He was really nervous about this conversation. He was feeling really guilty about his own possible involvement in it. Sam Bankman-Fried gives his own version of events, which is that he received this message while he was traveling that Nishad Singh wanted to talk. He was scheduled to get back later that night, and so he found Nishad Singh, and they went and had this conversation on the balcony. And he said that Nishad Singh was worried about possible liabilities, Alameda Research, and marketing. He said that the liabilities had, quote, gotten far larger than they were previously. He didn't know what to do. He wanted Sam Bankman-Fried's thoughts. He said that Nishad may have thrown out this $8 billion number, but basically he testified that he responded that, sure, this liability was larger than he wanted, but he thought that Alameda had positive net asset value. And so no big deal, right? Like, he was worried about it, but he wasn't, he didn't feel like it was that they were insolvent or something like that. So he totally downplays this conversation that Nishad Singh had testified to earlier in the case. And then they also start to talk about the marketing strategy, because Nishad Singh testified earlier in the case that during this conversation, he basically asked Sam Bankman-Fried to commit to spending less excessively on things, including marketing, and that Sam Bankman-Fried had sort of seemed to rein it in a little bit, but then he did all these big deals, including this deal with Michael Kivas, who's that like, influence peddler, basically, who he gave like a ton of money to. And he just brought it up that, like, oh, and also unconnected to that previous conversation, Nishad Singh was worried about marketing and felt like there wasn't, I don't know, that the spending wasn't appropriate, or that it wasn't even that. He was just worried that the marketing wasn't paying off, basically. And Sam Bankman-Fried said that he acknowledged that, oh, the marketing team was kind of a mess. And this was kind of clever, I thought, by the defense. I thought it was very transparent, but I, again, come at this with a very skeptical perspective. But so Nishad Singh had testified that during this conversation, he came to understand, basically, that Alameda Research was insolvent, and that the best thing that he could do, according to Sam, was to keep working at at these companies to try to make the money back. And that, this was basically that Sam Bankman-Fried basically told Nishad, like, you're so important, you're so critical to this business, basically guilting Nishad Singh into believing that, like, if he left, it could potentially tank the company. Like, he would somehow be responsible for not filling the gap that he at least testified that he had no knowledge of up until this point. And so, like, that was a really damning portion of Nishad's testimony. Well, this was a kind of a clever thing. Sam Bankman-Fried basically testified about how he acknowledged that the marketing team was a bit of a mess. They'd made some marketing investments that didn't pan out. But he still thought that the FTX arena, Tom Brady, the MLB arena, the Super Bowl commercial had all paid off pretty well. And he said that Nishad Singh basically had suggestions. Apparently there was another person, I forget who was involved in, like, reviewing some of the marketing stuff. And so he was like, you know what, you should feel welcome to, like, contribute to ideas of how we can do the marketing thing better. But he then later said, he claims that Nishad asked him, like, what should I be focusing on right now? And so Sam said that you're a great developer. I think the best thing, the best use of your time is to just work on development stuff. You're doing great work. I really appreciate your contributions. And so that was how he portrayed that same conversation that Nishad had portrayed as being this, like, attempt to guilt him into continuing to contribute to FTX so that they could, have any hope of keeping it afloat. So again, I thought that was clever. Again, I don't know if it was successful, but I thought it was, like, kind of a clever way of trying to reframe that. And that was the last part of the day. So at this point, it was 4:25. Cohen dismisses the jury, and then they have just a brief conversation about scheduling. So just to recap that very briefly, Cohen thinks he's going to finish direct on Monday morning by 11:30 or sooner. Danielle Sassoon, the assistant U.S. attorney, believes there will be, quote, significant cross-examination. At this point, there was laughter even in the courtroom, where usually they try to keep things really buttoned up, although I think after the jury leaves, maybe they're a little more lenient on that. But like, yeah, no shit, there's going to be significant cross-examination. That's why I am not on a plane right now. But she said basically she doesn't think anyone wants to sit through a day and a half of cross-examination. I might. I mean, I'd watch it. But I also don't want to because I do have a flight on Tuesday. So she basically said that like if the defense wraps up questioning him midday on Monday, she expects that, you know, between Monday afternoon and Tuesday, they should be finished. The defense says that they expect that they will briefly bring a rebuttal case after the prosecutor's cross-examination. They think it'll probably be 2 hours, but again, it's really hard to estimate those things when you haven't even heard the cross-examination. And then as for closing arguments, the government estimated there would be 2 to 3 hours plus rebuttal of closing. This defense said probably around the same. At this point, the woman next to me in the overflow room was audibly groaning at the length of that. I guess I don't know. Is that unreasonable? And then there's this conversation about the charge conference, which the judge says he would like for it to be 10 minutes, but expects that will be maybe somewhat protracted on the order of hours, which I think everyone pretty much agreed on. And so as a result, it's unlikely the case will go to the jury before, at the very earliest, Thursday or Friday. It could very well be into the following week. I'll note that according to the trial schedule, there's not supposed to be trial this Friday, but the judge is really trying to move this along. And so I think he's going to try to get them to sit for trial on Friday. Cohen asked that if the prosecution plans to do a rebuttal case after the defense case, he wants them to provide the identity of any witnesses they might call. This was the first time I learned that the prosecution can actually call new witnesses potentially in the rebuttal case. I didn't realize that was something they could do. Again, this is my first trial. So that should be spicy. The prosecution basically said, we are not going to be able to tell you that in advance of your you haven't even finished putting on your case, so we can't, confidently tell you who we will or will not call. But the judge basically said, like, just do your best, to try to keep people up to date. I think I made it. I think we're done. That was it. And at this point, I was like, oh God, because I was seriously trying to decide whether or not to stay. But I'm staying, and I did. So yeah, Monday, again, they estimated 2 hours for defense. I am hoping that it is not they wildly underestimated how long the defense questioning would take. They originally guessed it would be 4 hours. It was all of today, plus an estimated 2 hours on Monday. So I'm just hoping that they're not like, oopsie, we accidentally took all day. But like I said earlier, I do think that they were trying to stall to take as much time as they could today before the weekend, and they may not have that incentive on Monday. And so maybe they'll sort of speed things up a little bit. We'll see. And then it should be spicy for the cross-examination. By the end of the hearing yesterday, I was I wasn't feeling bad for Sam Bankman-Fried, but it's just it's a little hard to watch someone just get repeatedly slammed into the pavement, and that's sort of what it felt like. I don't think it's going to be better on Monday. She was a little bit restricted as far as what she could ask about because of the specific scope of that hearing that they had yesterday, and she won't be on Monday. So we'll see how it goes. It's going to be entertaining, I will tell you that. Okay, I think I'm going to sign off at this point because I am losing my voice, and also I really need to eat dinner. I would go back through the questions, but it's just a lot of scrolling. So if there were any questions that I didn't get to answer, feel free to leave them as a I don't know, comment on my Substack or just tweet at me. I don't know. I have 100 emails in my inbox. Nothing like Sam Bankman-Fried's inbox 60,000. So who am I to complain? But I am very behind on like emails and tweets and stuff just because I've been without internet access for the most like the better part of the past 2 days. But I'll be catching up on that stuff this weekend and hopefully doing some writing this weekend, but also maybe going, I don't know, doing something fun in New York. So somewhere near the courthouse, this keeps coming up on my Google Maps. There is an ice cream museum. Like every time I go to walk somewhere, I'm like trying to get between my hotel and the courthouse or to a coffee place or something like that. I just keep seeing, it's like Google wants me to see this ice cream museum. So like part of me is curious and I might go check that out, but we'll see. And I'm sure I will eat more pizza. So thank you all for tuning in to what was, again, a much longer live stream than it needed to be. I will try to condense things into newsletter posts at some point. And yeah, good night.